What if the most powerful people in history weren't just ruling empires, but sleeping under embalmed hearts, whispering to the moon, or dressing like porcelain dolls at war? These weren't just monarchs, they were living contradictions, wrapped in silk, superstition, and unsettling daily rituals. From honey-covered servants to ceremonial exorcisms, their strangest habits weren't quirks, they were policy. And behind every crown, a compulsion no one dared question. This isn't royalty, as you've seen it. It's royalty, unhinged. Welcome to 33 Weirdest Royal Habits, where power meets paranoia, and the throne is just another stage for the wonderfully bizarre. Before we dive headfirst into centuries of royal eccentricity, make sure you're subscribed, especially if strange bedtime history is your thing. We've got hours of madness ahead, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. While you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Midnight? 3 a.m.? Let's see who's the most sleep-deprived history addict in the kingdom. Charles VI of France, made of glass. It's hard to be king. Harder still when you believe you're one wrong move away from shattering into 1,000 jagged shards. Charles VI of France didn't just suffer from madness. He dressed it. He armoured it. He padded his royal robes with iron rods, wrapped his body in layers of reinforced fabric, and begged his courtiers not to touch him for fear he might literally break. Not metaphorically, not emotionally. Physically, he believed he was made of glass. The King of France, son of Charles V, heir to centuries of royal might, spent a considerable stretch of his life terrified of chairs, hugs, and tight hallways. Any unexpected jostle, he feared, could crack him open like fine crystal. This wasn't an isolated delusion. It was a philosophy of survival, meticulously woven into the daily rhythm of medieval court life. This glass delusion, what modern psychologists classify under the broader umbrella of somatic delusions, is rare but not unique to Charles. Still, he remains its most notorious royal patron. A king terrified of his own body, of its fragility, of the world's sharp corners. Now, it'd be tempting to laugh. Medieval kings were not exactly known for being relatable, and Charles VI's reign gives historians a buffet of bizarre. But his delusion wasn't comic, it was tragic. The man genuinely suffered. He walked like a man carrying a cathedral window on his spine, each movement cautious, ritualized, reverent, as if breaking himself would also break France. In some ways, maybe it did. Charles didn't always live this way. His early reign was, if not promising, at least functionally stable. But the madness arrived like a sharp gust through a stained glass chapel. Sudden, loud, and irreversible. In 1392, he suffered what most historians call a psychotic break. He attacked his own knights in a frenzy, eyes blank, swinging his sword at friends with the certainty of a man who saw something no one else did. He then fell into a catatonic state that stretched for months. When he emerged, he was changed. The attacks became episodic, the in-between times lucid and almost functional. But when the madness descended, it turned the royal palace into a madhouse, quiet, tense, and padded like his robes. There were days Charles couldn't remember who he was. Days he forgot he had a wife or children. At times, he refused to bathe or change clothes. He claimed not to be the king at all. Other times, he recognized his throne but would refuse to sit, fearful the act might chip his spine. The image of a padded king, floating like a fragile sculpture through the grand stone halls of Paris, is one of those historical visuals too strange for fiction. His servants moved carefully. His doctors muttered diagnoses they barely understood, and around it all, the business of royalty still churned on. France still needed a king. Wars still needed waging, politics still needed stabbing. His delusion eventually became part of the furniture, something the court learned to walk around. He was addressed with courtesy, handled like porcelain, and spoken of in whispers. The phrase Charles the Mad would later become his epithet, but in his own time, no one dared say it aloud. Madness in royalty was like a cracked cathedral window. You didn't point it out unless you wanted the whole building to collapse. But let's pause here because this is where things get morally uncomfortable. Was Charles mad, or was he simply a mirror? Here was a monarch convinced of his own fragility, in a time when monarchy itself was increasingly fragile. France, under his reign, became a web of betrayals, puppet councils, and civil wars. The 100 Years' War dragged on, nobles schemed. The peasants, when not starving, rebelled. The Glass King became a symbol of the kingdom's own fractures. It wasn't just Charles who felt like he might shatter. France, too, was splintering. And the image of a padded king, unable to touch his subjects or even his own family, resonates differently when you consider how far removed medieval rulers already were from the people they governed. Power at that level isolates, it cushions, it insulates. Perhaps Charles took it a bit too literally. Or perhaps he was simply the first to notice what kingship really did to the human soul. Modern psychiatrists would likely call his condition a mix of schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or perhaps a severe delusional disorder. But the diagnosis barely matters now. What matters is that a king who ruled millions believed himself more breakable than a goblet, and the kingdom went along with it. He was king by divine right, but governed by a rational fear, and yet the kingdom still functioned. Which raises the truly unsettling question: how much of history has been steered by people just barely holding themselves together? Charles VI padded himself to survive the day, and somehow so did France. It wouldn't be the last time a ruler confused the palace for a padded cell, or the last time the throne disguised itself as therapy. After all, what is monarchy, if not a daily ritual of mass delusion? But then, just a century later, another royal would embrace ritual as spectacle, not to hide his madness, but to canonize his own body. Because if Charles thought he was glass, Louis XIV decided he was the Sunday. Louis XIV of France, public wake-up and bedtime. Imagine opening your eyes each morning to the sound of trumpets, the scent of perfumed air, and the hushed awe of 30 grown men watching you stretch. Welcome to the morning routine of Louis XIV of France. The Sun King didn't just rule, he woke up for an audience. He brushed his teeth for applause. He went to bed like it was theatre. And it kind of was. Every day at Versailles, without fail, Louis XIV enacted the most elaborately choreographed personal routine in royal history, an event called the lever, literally, the getting up. It was followed each evening by its inverse twin, the coucher, the going to bed. These weren't just rituals, they were sacred, political, religious even. Each step, each stocking, shirt, gesture, or cough was structured, witnessed, recorded, and ranked. Only the most important courtiers could watch the king sit up in bed. Slightly less important ones were allowed to observe him put on shoes. Everyone else waited in line like a medieval fan convention. And for what? To catch a glimpse of a man getting dressed. Louis understood something most kings forgot, that power isn't real unless it's seen. So he turned his daily habits into statecraft. The court of Versailles didn't just orbit the king metaphorically, it did so literally, and on a strict daily schedule. If Charles VI's padded solitude represented the isolation of monarchy, then Louis XIV's choreographed mornings were its complete public exposure. Opposite delusions, same crown. It's important to understand that these weren't casual affairs. There was a protocol book. There were official roles like First Valet of the Wardrobe or Grand Chamberlain of the Bed. Imagine being appointed by the state to hand a man his shirt in the correct order. Imagine that shirt change determining whether your family got a castle. The lever began each day around 8:30 a.m. when the first valet entered the royal bedchamber to announce it was time. Then came the royal doctors, who peered at the sleeping king like scholars reviewing a sacred text. After them, the barber, the confessor, and the honor group of courtiers ranked in exact order of privilege, who watched as Louis slowly stirred, prayed, accepted his wig, and endured what must have been the most scrutinized shave in Europe. He didn't even dress himself. That would have been beneath him. No, dressing was done to him, as a rite, as a ceremony, as a form of state-sponsored worship. And this wasn't just about making nobles feel involved. It was a control mechanism, a way of draining their political energy into something absurdly mundane. Want to overthrow the monarchy? Sorry, you're too busy arguing about who gets to buckle the royal garters today. Every article of clothing had its own politics. One duke might be honored with presenting the left sleeve, another might suffer the shame of being excluded from the sock ceremony. If you think it sounds ridiculous, congratulations, you're beginning to understand how Louis XIV ruled. By turning his daily routine into a courtly hunger game, he neutralized the threat of rebellion. Nobles, once dangerous warlords with armies, were now glorified footmen in a very fancy dressing room. Versailles didn't need prison bars. It had etiquette, weaponized politeness. Everyone was too busy vying for towel privileges to conspire. The coucher, his nightly retirement, was no less formal. Around 10 p.m., the king would publicly withdraw, undress in front of select witnesses, say goodnight with practiced solemnity, and allow himself to be tucked in by courtiers. He'd then promptly get up again after they left, sneak off to his mistress or another private room, and live like an actual human for a few hours. Because here's the irony, the whole thing was fake. Theatre, a staged monarchy within a real one. Louis didn't actually need anyone to dress him. He could have just closed the curtains. But that was never the point. The point was visibility, symbolism, power performed so relentlessly that no one had time to question whether it was real. And for a while, it worked. France obeyed, nobles submitted, foreign monarchs trembled. And Louis became the living embodiment of absolute power. An eternal sunrise, a human calendar, the sun himself. But you can't maintain that kind of theatre forever. The audience eventually tires. The actors start to forget their lines. By the time the 18th century arrived, Versailles had become so soaked in ritual and rot that it barely remembered what actual governance looked like. The performance had become the reality. And beneath the satin and splendor, there was always something hollow, something fragile, something that looked suspiciously like madness but dressed better. Because while Louis built his court into a mirror of celestial order, another emperor across time, across an empire, was stepping into the dirt arena in a loincloth, not for ritual, not for performance, but for combat. Because sometimes a king doesn't want to be watched dressing. Sometimes a king just wants to bleed. Commodus fought as a gladiator. Every empire has its breaking point. Rome's came wearing armor made of gold and a crown shaped like Hercules' lion-skin hood. Emperor Commodus, son of Marcus Aurelius, heir to the Stoics, descendant of military genius, walked into the gladiator arena not as a patron, but as a participant. This wasn't a one-time political stunt or a PR move to stir the plebs. It was routine, ritual. A daily dose of theatre soaked in muscle oil and self-delusion. Commodus, emperor of the most powerful civilization on earth, spent his mornings ruling the Roman state and his afternoons fighting like a street brawler in staged blood sport. not in disguise, not in secret, but front and center, spotlit, cheered, adored. Or at least, he thought so. Let's pause and appreciate the contrast. His father, Marcus Aurelius, had scribbled Meditations, a notebook of private Stoic reflections still quoted centuries later by philosophers and corporate CEOs. Commodus scribbled nothing. He flexed. He posed. He allegedly entered the arena dressed as Mercury, or Mars, or sometimes Hercules himself, wielding wooden swords against terrified opponents paid to lose. At best, it was delusion. At worst, it was a calculated humiliation ritual forced on Rome itself. Because make no mistake, no one could say no to him. The Senate may have found it degrading, the army may have grumbled, but none of them could stop him. The emperor wanted to fight, so the empire pretended it was noble. Now, to be clear, Commodus wasn't risking much. The matches were staged. His opponents were either criminals forced into combat or trained professionals ordered to lose. Some historians say he charged the Roman treasury a fortune per appearance, millions of sesterces for every victory, billed as gladiatorial service. He essentially paid himself for performing fantasies in front of a captive audience. And yet, something about it still felt dangerous, not because of the swordplay, but because of what it revealed. Here was an emperor who didn't want to govern. He wanted to cosplay his own mythology. He didn't see Rome as a responsibility. He saw it as a colosseum. He wasn't the first emperor to dabble in showmanship, but Commodus wasn't dabbling. This was full immersion. He renamed months after himself. He declared himself a living god. He handed out statues of Hercules with his own face attached. He referred to the Senate not as Rome's ruling body, but as the Gladiator Guild. And somewhere along the way, the political machinery of the empire began to snap. The problem wasn't just that he fought. It was that he redefined power as performance, government as showmanship, justice as spectacle. Everything became about audience and applause. There were no ministers, just stagehands, no advisors, just costume designers. The empire's rituals, once solemn, strange, and rooted in centuries of tradition, were replaced with cheap theatrical gimmicks, and Commodus insisted on playing the lead. Ironically, the people kind of loved it, at least at first. The grain kept flowing. The games were thrilling. The emperor seemed accessible in a way previous ones hadn't. What's not to like about a god king who also happens to do his own stunts? But spectacle is a fragile thing. It needs a set. It needs lighting. It needs everyone to clap on cue. And behind the velvet curtain, Rome was rotting. Corruption bloomed. The economy sagged. Military discipline frayed. And all the while, Commodus trained with his gladiator instructors and polished his golden armor, convinced he was immortal, invulnerable, heroic. He even once declared, "Rome is nothing without me." A line that sounds noble until you realize it wasn't about Rome at all. It was about the applause. Behind every staged match, behind every ceremonial strut through the amphitheater, was a kind of madness so theatrical it almost resembled sanity. After all, what was the Roman Empire, if not one giant stage, perpetually reenacting its own greatness? Commodus understood the performance, he just didn't understand the limits. So, what do you do with an emperor who wants to be a god and a gladiator? History had an answer. But we're not telling that part. Because the mystery isn't how Commodus died, it's how long Rome let him live like that. How long the Senate looked away. How long the people cheered. How far a civilization will go to indulge one man's fantasy if it means avoiding their own reality. And yet, just a few emperors later, Rome found itself bowing to another man of ritual, but one who worships something far stranger than glory. He didn't fight in the arena. He built a shrine inside the palace, and he crowned himself not as emperor, but as high priest of the Sunday. Elagabalus ran Rome like a sun god shrine. There are two kinds of emperors, those who govern and those who glow. Elagabalus, Roman emperor at the tender age of 14, belonged very firmly to the latter. He didn't see the palace as a place of power. He saw it as a temple. Not to Jupiter, not to Rome, but to Elagabal, the sun god of his ancestral Syrian homeland. And so, for the brief 4 years of his rule, the Roman Empire didn't just endure religious chaos. It was restructured, repainted, and redirected to face east. Because the emperor didn't consider himself a ruler at all. He considered himself a priest. The empire, to him, was not a state, it was a sanctuary. Now, imagine this scene. The emperor of Rome parading through the city in a gold-embroidered robe, leading a chariot drawn not by horses, but by sacred cattle, while hauling an enormous meteorite, the black stone that represented Elagabal, across the city. Senators forced to walk behind, citizens told to bow, drums, incense, chants. A midday sun cult staged with the enthusiasm of a teenager who just discovered special effects. And this wasn't a one-off. This was the new normal. Elagabalus believed that the sun god, his sun god, was not just superior to Jupiter, but destined to become the singular deity of the Roman world. And because he was both priest and emperor, this meant the entire structure of imperial ritual, Roman tradition, and everyday civic religion had to be rewritten daily. Temples were rededicated. Statues of Roman gods were paraded through the city and forced to witness the greatness of Elagabal. The Vestal Virgins, the most sacred priestesses of Rome, were reportedly ordered to participate in sun rites that defied centuries of taboo. The emperor didn't just dabble in blasphemy, he institutionalized it. Now, to be clear, Rome wasn't unfamiliar with importing gods. The pantheon, after all, is a spiritual buffet. But what made Elagabalus different was the exclusivity. The empire could tolerate one more god. It could not tolerate one god claiming to be the only one, especially not one that came with a teenage prophet who dressed in silk and gold and insisted on leading sunrise prayers from the palace balcony every morning. His daily rituals weren't subtle. At dawn, ceremonies were held in the temple he'd built for Elagabal, placed on the Palatine Hill, above all others. Sacrifices were made, music was played. The emperor, in his priestly garb, would personally perform the rites. Not delegate them, not merely observe, lead them. This might have been seen as pious if he hadn't also decreed that his god should marry the Roman goddess Vesta. That's right, Elagabal, the Syrian sunstone, was to be wedded to Rome's most sacred hearth deity. The marriage was celebrated like a state wedding, complete with processions, feasts, and mandatory attendance. It wasn't just a metaphor, it was policy. Because in Elagabalus's mind, the spiritual union of gods was the fastest path to unifying the empire, whether the gods wanted it or not. This obsessive fusion of religion and monarchy wasn't just inconvenient, it was revolutionary. The Roman elite didn't mind eccentric emperors. They could survive debauchery. They could survive incompetence. But religious centralization, especially centered around a foreign cult, was a different matter entirely. It was as if the empire had become a theocracy overnight. Every morning, every gesture, every public decree was now filtered through the logic of solar devotion. The emperor's role was no longer military, political, or judicial. It was liturgical. And then there were the rumors. Ancient sources, hostile, gossipy, and always dramatic, claim he replaced the traditional Senate meeting rituals with incense offerings and priestly invocations. That he refused to speak policy unless the omens were favorable. that public festivals turned into mandatory religious reenactments, that the imperial court began to resemble a sacred order more than a government. Was it true? Hard to say. The records were written by men who loathed him. But here's what we do know. The rituals were real. The god was real to him. And the emperor's daily life was structured not around administration, but around worship. Eventually, Rome revolted not with swords at first, but with silence. The applause dried up. The rituals became awkward. The support networks, those invisible social gears that kept even the strangest emperors in motion, stalled. His grandmother, who had once backed his rise, withdrew. The Praetorian Guard muttered, and the priests of the old gods watched, tight-lipped, as the boy emperor swung incense over Rome's political future like a censer in a funeral rite. Elagabalus didn't die because he was strange. He died because he interrupted the ritual of Rome. But the question that lingers isn't whether he was mad, it's whether he was right. Because he saw something no other emperor had dared to see so clearly. That religion, when performed daily and publicly, was more powerful than law. That spectacle beats tradition. That the empire would follow whatever shone the brightest until it didn't. And long before his stone temple was torn down, another emperor would rise in a different land, on a different throne, who shared his instinct for purity. But he wouldn't build a temple. He'd carry water, and refused to drink anything else. Akbar the Great only drank Ganges water. Power has its tastes. For some rulers, it's wine. For others, it's conquest. For Akbar the Great, third Mughal emperor of India, it was the water of the Ganges, not metaphorically, not spiritually, literally, day after day, week after week, the most powerful man on the subcontinent drank only from one river. A ritual so specific, so committed, and so logistically ridiculous, it became one of the great imperial habits of his time. Akbar's reign, spanning the late 16th century, was defined by ambition and eccentricity in equal measure. He ruled over a vast and expanding empire, governed through a mixture of tolerance, statecraft, and terrifying personal intensity. But when it came to his daily beverage, all that administrative pragmatism evaporated. He trusted only one liquid, Majal, as it was sometimes called, the water of Mother Ganga. And he trusted it enough to build an entire infrastructure around it. Ganges water, collected from the river's upper reaches, was carefully drawn, sealed in silver vessels, and transported across hundreds of miles to wherever the emperor happened to be palace, battlefield, or wilderness. The water had to remain pure, untouched, unspoiled. Protected by men whose job was not merely to serve the emperor, but to serve the fluid that served the emperor. Now, it would be easy to file this under spiritual reverence, and to some degree, that's true. The Ganges was and remains sacred to millions, but Akbar's water ritual wasn't just about piety, it was about purity. Purity not as a virtue, but as a system, a worldview, an operating principle for daily life. According to court chroniclers, Akbar viewed the Ganges water as light and pure above all other waters. He believed it enhanced longevity, that it cleansed not only the body but the mind, that its taste was unmatched, and perhaps most tellingly, that other water, local, foreign, or even mountain spring was somehow corrupt, impure. Not dangerous, necessarily, but unsuitable for the man tasked with holding the empire together. It was not a practical habit. It was not rational, but it was consistent, unwavering, as reliable as the sunrise and far more expensive. And here's where it gets stranger. This wasn't a quiet, private quirk. It was policy. Court servants were assigned to oversee the Ganges water supply. Distances were measured, travel times calculated. Caravans were dispatched weeks in advance to ensure the emperor never had to settle for the wrong source. The silver flasks used to store the water were polished with obsessive precision. Woe to the servant who spilled a drop. In a land as geographically and culturally diverse as Mughal India, the exclusivity of this habit stood out. Akbar, known for his efforts to unify Hindus and Muslims under a syncretic state religion, Dini Ilahi, who championed debates between Jesuits, Sufis, Brahmins and Zoroastrians, had decided that no liquid besides Ganges water was worthy of touching his lips. What makes this fascinating isn't the belief itself, but the scale of accommodation. Entire supply chains were reoriented around a single daily need, and that daily need became ritual. And that ritual became identity. Akbar didn't just drink Ganges water, he became the kind of man who drinks Ganges water. Every sip was a reaffirmation of control not just over his body, but over nature, belief, and bureaucracy. Which leads to the obvious question, was it just about health? Maybe. The Ganges, especially in its upper Himalayan stretches, was cleaner than many local sources. Mughal medical advisors might have encouraged the practice as hygienic, though their understanding of disease was more spiritual than bacterial. But this wasn't hydration. This was ceremony. He could drink nothing else. To refuse other water in the arid climate of the Indian plains wasn't just fussy, it was dangerous. But that's the point. He trusted the river more than the people who offered him alternatives. It was a kind of spiritual security system. No poison in Ganges water, no conspiracy in a silver flask. The river had no politics, no ambition, no betrayal. Only purity. And yet, the irony sits heavy. Akbar, the reformer. Akbar, the unifier. Akbar, the visionary who abolished the jizya tax and opened his court to all creeds, was on a daily level consumed by a personal ritual of spiritual exclusivity. Everyone else could drink what they liked, but he would drink only what the river had given, a private rigidity in the life of a public liberal. It's one of those contradictions that make sense only inside the mind of an emperor, or perhaps outside it. Because to govern millions, to balance armies and religions and egos, to wake each morning knowing that every word you say might shift history, it's no wonder some rulers cling to small absolutes. A taste, a texture, a ritual that never changes. And Akbar had his, bottled, polished, delivered daily. But while Akbar sought purity through water, another emperor found satisfaction in something even stranger. He didn't sip, he yanked. Not rituals of hydration, but of extraction. Because next comes a man who carried his royal power in his pocket and liked to use it to pull your teeth. Peter, the great hobby dentist. When most people talk about reform, they mean laws, institutions, trade policies. Peter the Great of Russia? He meant teeth, not metaphorically, literally. As in forceps, jaws, molars. He didn't just modernize Russia from the top down, he drilled into it from the mouth out. In a reign famous for dragging Russia, sometimes kicking and screaming, into something resembling modern Europe, Peter carried many instruments of reform. One of them was a dental toolkit. He kept it close. He used it often, and he wasn't shy about his technique. In fact, he practiced on soldiers, sailors, peasants, diplomats, even friends. Imagine showing up for a political meeting and leaving with one less tooth. That was, more or less, the risk of an audience with the Tsar. You see, Peter wasn't content to reform his empire through policy. That was too slow, too abstract. He wanted to feel the change, to enact it personally, with his hands. Which is probably why his definition of being a hands-on ruler included literal bloodletting and impromptu dental surgery. He was fascinated with tools, mechanics, anatomy, anything that could be taken apart and put back together. His court was filled with machines and models. He famously disguised himself as a common labourer to study shipbuilding in the Netherlands, and somewhere along the line, teeth became a personal obsession. Dental hygiene in 17th century Russia was, in a word, primitive. Toothache? You lived with it. Infection? You prayed. But Peter didn't just accept the state of things, he went after the source with pliers and a sense of grim determination. His dental tools still exist, preserved in the Kunstkamera, Russia's first museum, founded by Peter himself. The tools sit quietly next to a grotesque collection of preserved fetuses and malformed animals. But among the specimens is a tidy little box. Peter's personal extraction kit. Inside it, a pile of teeth. Dozens of them, carefully arranged. Some say he kept them as trophies. Others say they were evidence proof of his own willingness to do the dirty work. Peter's impromptu surgeries weren't always requested. People didn't exactly line up to have the sour root around in their mouths. But then again, how do you say no to a man who towers over you in height, who's prone to sudden rages, and who also happens to rule the entire country? It wasn't just dentistry, of course. Peter was a walking compendium of uncomfortable hobbies. He organized human dissections. He practiced surgery. He enjoyed pulling nails from boards with his bare hands, then putting them back just to see if it could be done faster. He once had a man executed for being lazy and then personally inspected the body's arteries. But the teeth, those were special, because they weren't political. They were intimate. There is something uniquely invasive about dentistry. You have to trust someone completely to let them inside your mouth with sharp tools. Or, in Peter's case, you don't trust them at all, you just hold them down and get to work. What's remarkable is how routine it became. The Tsar at work in his palace, and there he is, sleeves rolled up, grinning like a lunatic, reaching into someone's mouth with iron forceps. Ministers standing around awkwardly, someone coughing into a handkerchief, a noble wincing, and Peter muttering in a mix of Dutch and Russian, convinced he's saving the nation one bicuspid at a time. It wasn't all madness, at least not by the standards of the time. Peter saw his personal interventions, his manual, often painful style of leadership, as a metaphor for reform itself. Russia was sick. Russia was infected. It had wrought deep in the bone, and Peter, naturally, would be the one to dig it out. And dig he did. In policy, in city planning, in naval design, in etiquette, in religion. He imposed a beard tax. He redesigned the calendar. He moved the capital from Moscow to a city he built from scratch on a swamp. He invited foreigners. He exiled traditionalists. He even changed how Russians dressed. But amid all the sweeping reforms, the tooth-pulling stands out not because it was absurd, though it was, but because it captures something essential about the man. Peter didn't believe in distance. Not between himself and the people, not between his fingers and someone else's molars. He wanted contact, pressure, results. He was a Tsar with pliers in his pocket and Europe in his sights, and if your teeth happened to get in the way, well, that was just history grinding forward. But for all his surgical confidence, Peter wasn't alone in his medical eccentricities. Just a few generations earlier, another royal took the obsession with hands-on healing even further. Because if Peter liked to pull teeth, James IV of Scotland preferred to cut a little deeper. James IV of Scotland hands-on surgery. Royal hobbies tend to fall into predictable categories: falconry, poetry, maybe a little fencing if the crown feels frisky. But James IV of Scotland had a hobby that defied all sense of royal decorum. He practiced surgery, real, messy, invasive surgery, with knives, on people, voluntarily. This wasn't symbolic. This wasn't metaphor. It was medical intervention, done by the king himself. A monarch not just interested in healing his realm, but actively, personally invested in opening up its subjects, one body at a time. Historians describe James IV as a Renaissance man, educated, curious, deeply engaged in theology, literature, alchemy, architecture, and the sciences. He spoke multiple languages fluently. He studied astrology and astronomy. He founded Scotland's first printing press. But his fascination with medicine stands out not for its sophistication, but for its unnerving proximity. There are verified records of James performing bloodletting and minor surgical procedures. He funded barber surgeons, encouraged public health initiatives, and, more often than is comfortable, took scalpel in hand and did it himself. Not in the metaphorical, let me lead the way sense. In the actual, roll up your sleeves, apply pressure to the wound sense. In a time when most kings kept a safe diplomatic distance from infection and gore, James leaned in. To him, medicine wasn't beneath royalty. It required royalty. He believed healing was an extension of kingship, a sacred responsibility. The crown didn't just rule the body politic. It patched wounds, it drained blood, it diagnosed. There's a curious intimacy in this image. The King of Scotland, dressed not in regalia, but in the rough apron of a field doctor, crouched over a peasant's infected arm, murmuring Latin names of herbs while applying poultices by candlelight. It's simultaneously noble, bizarre, and deeply unsettling. Why did he do it? It wasn't sadism, not vanity either. James was deadly serious about the sciences. He believed medicine, when properly studied, was a gateway to understanding the human soul. In an age still dominated by humours and astrological diagnosis, he pushed for evidence-based observation. He commissioned anatomical texts. He sponsored surgical research. He held debates at court about the composition of blood. But he also believed that practice made understanding, that knowledge required action, that healing couldn't be delegated entirely. And so he practiced on real people, including, allegedly, prisoners. There's a story, one of those historical anecdotes that sits uneasily between documentation and rumour about James funding a remote island experiment. He allegedly sent a mute woman and 2 children to an isolated island with a deaf-mute caretaker to study whether language would naturally emerge without outside influence. A linguistic experiment wrapped in royal curiosity. If it's true, it's chilling. If it's not, it still says something about his reputation. People believed he was capable of that level of scientific detachment. More reliably, we know James frequented apothecaries. He personally funded the construction of hospitals. He carried out dental work. He engaged in regular discussions with medical practitioners and took notes. There's even record of him performing surgical procedures under the supervision of his court physicians, indicating not a performance, but genuine involvement. Imagine, if you will, a king stepping into a makeshift surgical chamber. Candlelight flickering off brass instruments, a patient on the table breathing shallowly, a crowd of scholars half nervous, half awed, and there stands James, crown off, sleeves rolled, holding a scalpel with the same hand that signs edicts and commands armies. This wasn't theatre, it was belief, a conviction that healing the body was part of governing the soul. That a good ruler had to understand the pain of his people, literally. But this closeness came with consequences. The boundary between crown and commoner blurred. Power became personal, risky, intimate. And when James finally fell at the Battle of Flodden in 1513, cut down in a catastrophic defeat, the symbolism felt bitterly poetic. A king obsessed with the human body died in a heap of them. No surgery could save him. His corpse was never officially recovered. Rumors say it was taken, desecrated, lost. Others say it was buried in secret. Regardless, the man who once believed in precise incisions was ultimately swallowed whole by the blunt force of war. Still, James left behind a curious legacy, a ruler not afraid of blood, only of ignorance, a man who thought the crown should feel what the kingdom felt, nerve by nerve, vessel by vessel. But if James explored the human body out of fascination, our next royal did it out of paranoia. Because while James tried to fix people, the next sultan prowled the streets at night not to heal, but to hunt. Murad IV, Ottoman Sultan, prowled the city in disguise. Some rulers issue decrees from gilded thrones, others send enforcers to carry out their will in the streets. But Murad IV, Sultan of the Ottoman Empire in the 17th century, didn't believe in distance. He believed in direct observation, preferably under cover of darkness, in disguise, on foot, while personally stalking the back alleys of Istanbul. Imagine being a coffee vendor in a forbidden district. Just after midnight, you've got a few regulars huddled under lanterns, sipping cautiously, murmuring poetry or rebellion, depending on the night. Then a quiet figure appears, well-dressed but anonymous. Maybe a tradesman, maybe a soldier. His gaze lingers a little too long. You pour the drink anyway. Moments later, he pulls back the hood, reveals himself, and announces you're in violation of imperial law. The punishment? Swift, unquestioned, enacted on the spot. Because that man, your final customer of the night, is the Sultan himself. Murad IV didn't rule through rumor. He ruled through fear, but not fear as abstraction fear, as physical presence. During his reign, 1623-1640, he became infamous for prowling the streets of Istanbul at night, dressed in common clothes, to personally enforce the moral laws he'd laid down. No alcohol, no tobacco, no coffee houses, no late-night gatherings, no seditious talk. And if he caught you, there were no appeals, no warnings, only the cold efficiency of imperial justice, administered not by a distant bureaucracy, but by the very hand that had written the law. This wasn't rumor. Multiple contemporary sources, both Ottoman and European, described the Sultan's nightly patrols. These were not ceremonial. They were not symbolic. They were practical. Murad didn't trust reports. He didn't trust advisors. He didn't trust ministers who might lie to save face or guard their networks of influence. So he did what emperors almost never do. He went out, in person, into the smoke and grime and mud of his own capital. The bans he enforced were not arbitrary, though they were harsh. In his eyes, the empire was decaying from within, rotted by idleness, softened by pleasure, weakened by unchecked vice. He saw alcohol not as indulgence, but as sedition. Coffee houses weren't just places to drink, they were places to talk, to plot, to question. Tobacco was sin made visible in smoke. His crackdown was moral, political, and psychological, and it wasn't just about the rules, it was about making the people believe the walls could hear them, that every shadow might carry a crown. He came to power young, just 11 years old. His early years on the throne were controlled by regents, eunuchs, and palace intrigue. But as he grew, so did his resolve to rule without mediation. When he fully seized power in his 20s, his transformation was swift and brutal. The carefree boy vanished. In his place stood a man who believed in central authority with the zeal of a convert. His reforms were sweeping. He reinstated military discipline, cracked down on corruption, and centralized power like few before him. But the most vivid and infamous part of his reign remained the nightly visits, not from palace officials, not from spies, from him. His disguises were convincing, at least convincing enough to fool vendors, shopkeepers, loiterers, and even city guards. He would walk among them silently, listening, watching. If he saw a violation, he acted, not always lethally, but never leniently. Some offenders were punished publicly the next morning, a clear signal that nothing went unseen. Others were never heard from again. His cruelty, though undeniable, was not without purpose, at least not in his mind. He believed the empire needed cleansing, discipline, focus, and the only way to restore that was to model absolute vigilance. That meant showing up, unexpectedly, relentlessly. The Sultan as a shadow, always watching, always judging. The paradox, of course, is that while Murad enforced public morality with the intensity of a religious zealot, his own private habits were far from ascetic. Historical sources suggest he drank heavily in secret, that he indulged in the very pleasures he outlawed, that the man who banned tobacco often smoked in private chambers, away from the eyes of his terrified subjects. But that hypocrisy only made his behavior more terrifying. If even he couldn't obey the rules, what chance did anyone else have? He died young, at just 27. But in those short years, he carved out one of the most fear-drenched reigns in Ottoman history, not because of what he commanded, but because of what he personally enforced. And here lies the strange twist of Murad IV's rule. The Sultan, disguised as a commoner, did not lessen the distance between ruler and ruled. It widened it, because now no one knew who was watching. The streets of Istanbul were not ruled by soldiers or bureaucrats. They were ruled by a rumour, walking. But while Murad patrolled the city in search of sin, another royal figure, far to the north, was quietly practicing her own form of nocturnal devotion. She didn't hunt lawbreakers. She slept beneath a heart. Maria Eleonora of Brandenburg, Queen of Sweden, slept under a heart. In the long and sombre corridors of 17th century Swedish royalty, few stories linger with the same eerie stillness as that of Maria Eleonora of Brandenburg, a queen consort, widow, and mother, yes, but also a woman whose grief did not end with her husband's death. It simply changed form, hardened, took shape, became a ritual. And that ritual involved a heart. Not a symbolic one, not a token or a poem or a painted portrait, but the actual preserved heart of her husband, King Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden, suspended in a golden casket, hung above the bed she shared with their daughter. There it remained day and night for years, watching, witnessing, weighing down the silence between them. To outsiders, this was grotesque, excessive, even pathological. But to Maria Eleonora, it was an act of fidelity, of devotion so complete it no longer distinguished between the living and the dead. Gustavus Adolphus died in 1632 in the chaos of battle at Lutzen during the 30 Years' War. His death shocked Sweden and echoed across Europe. But for Maria Eleonora, it was not an event, it was an undoing. The man who had once been her political match, her monarch, and in her own fervent telling, her great love, was now gone. And her grip on the boundaries between mourning and madness began to slip. When his body was returned to Sweden, she insisted on being near it, not symbolically, physically. She reportedly kept his heart with her, refused to bury it, and demanded it remain suspended in her chambers like a royal relic. It was no longer simply a part of him, it became a part of her. Her daily presence, her nightly comfort, her interior architecture. The room where she slept became a shrine, draped in black, sealed against light, windows shuttered, curtains thick, clocks silenced, mirrors covered. It was a chamber of permanent dusk, designed not to accommodate the living, but to preserve the dead. For her daughter, the young and future Queen Christina, this was not just home. It was an upbringing surrounded by stillness, grief, and the heavy, golden casket of a father no longer breathing. Christina later described the environment as suffocating. The sorrow didn't just hang in the air, it was the air. Maria Eleonora, gripped by a fixation with death, could not part from the remains of her husband. She reportedly spoke to the heart, addressed it as if it still governed the household, and referred to Gustavus in the present tense, not as nostalgia, but as conviction. This wasn't entirely unprecedented. The royal obsession with embalming, relics, and bodily remains had long been entangled with politics and piety. Saints had their bones venerated, kings were buried in elaborate stages. But Maria's attachment was something different, less public, more personal, less state ritual, more private liturgy. It was not performed for court, or God, or history. It was for her, a single, deliberate refusal to let time do its work. And this ritual didn't just center around the heart. She reportedly kept parts of Gustavus's blood-soaked clothing, refused to allow anyone to clean the linens he had last touched. For a time, she even resisted placing his body in the royal crypt. It was as though she was trying to slow decomposition itself through sheer force of will. If she could not resurrect him, she could at least preserve the evidence that he had once existed. The Swedish court, meanwhile, struggled with how to handle this new, ambient madness. Maria Eleonora's political influence had always been limited. Gustavus had preferred to keep her at a ceremonial distance, but now even her ceremonial role became difficult to maintain. Diplomats whispered. Servants muttered. Governing continued, but a strange shadow now hung over the royal household, cast not by ambition or scandal, but by grief that refused to recede. Eventually, she was declared unfit to raise Christina, and guardianship was transferred to the state. The girl was removed from her mother's house and from the casketed heart that had become its centerpiece. Maria Eleonora's isolation deepened. Her behavior remained erratic. The court quietly moved on. History would later tuck her away as a minor, melancholic footnote to Sweden's golden age. But even now, her story refuses to vanish entirely. Because it poses an uncomfortably human question: what if mourning isn't something to be endured, but inhabited? What if grief can become ritual? And what if, in a world where everything is eventually taken kings, titles, youth, meaning the one thing you can hold on to is the very thing everyone else wants to bury? Maria Eleonora chose not to let go, and in doing so, became something rarer than a queen, a relic keeper, not of saints, not of kingdoms, but of memory distilled in flesh. Of course, not every royal could be so still in their grief. Some dragged their dead husbands with them. One queen took her embalmed king on tour, because sometimes not even death can stop a royal from staying close. Joanna of Castile lived with her husband's corpse. History has no shortage of tragic queens, but few are written with as much quiet dread as Joanna of Castile, known to the centuries by a nickname as cruel as it is misleading: Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. But madness, if that's what it was, didn't begin with hallucinations or divine visions. It began with love, or something shaped like it. When her husband, Philip the Handsome, died suddenly in 1506, Joanna did not bury him. She did not move on. She did not mourn in silence or withdraw into a convent. Number. She travelled with him, not in memory, not in metaphor, but with his actual, embalmed body. For years. It began as a refusal. Philip's death at just 28, probably from typhoid fever, though some whispered poison struck Joanna like a hammer to the ribs. Their marriage, turbulent and obsessive, had never been simple. Philip was handsome, charming, and serially unfaithful. Joanna was brilliant, emotional, and deeply attached. But when he died, whatever part of her had been tempered by rationality seemed to slip away. What replaced it was not hysteria. It was ritual, routine. She began treating his corpse not as remains, but as royal presence, as something still animate, still central, still hers. The body was embalmed, dressed, placed in a coffin, and then loaded into a carriage. Joanna had it moved with her as she wandered through Castile, avoiding convents, delaying burial, sometimes arriving at night so that no women would be near the corpse, driven by a conviction that his body must not be defiled by other feminine presences. She slept near the coffin, prayed near it, ordered it opened periodically, just to look. And she did this not for days, not for weeks, but for years. Her journeys were slow, almost funereal processions that never ended. When the royal entourage arrived in a village, locals were stunned by the sight of the Queen's caravan, somber, deliberate, and heavy with the unmistakable presence of a sealed coffin. Rumors spread quickly that the body was mummified, that she spoke to it, that she imagined him responding. Whether any of that is true is unclear, but the coffin's physical presence is not in doubt. It was real. It was constant. The court was horrified, the nobility embarrassed, the clergy unsettled. Joanna, by then technically Queen of Castile, had become a political liability. Her father, Ferdinand of Aragon, moved swiftly to declare her unfit to rule. Her son, the future Emperor Charles V, would eventually continue the claim. But none of them seemed to ask the more difficult question: what exactly was Joanna doing? Was this truly madness? Or was it grief in a form no one could accept? Is it so different, after all, from the polished portraits and mourning rings that lined every royal chamber in Europe? Is a widow sleeping beside a coffin really more absurd than one wearing black for life, or commissioning endless requiem masses, or preserving a lock of hair inside a diamond? Joanna's behavior crossed a line not because it was bizarre, but because it was visible, persistent, embodied. She turned her grief into logistics, her love into itinerary. And that love, however distorted, was not unearned. She had adored Philip with a desperation that alarmed observers even while he lived. She burned with jealousy, feared his infidelity, was consumed with the fear of losing him, even before she lost him. When he died, the obsessive devotion simply turned inward. Without a living object to fixate on, she fixed on what remained, the body itself. Eventually, Joanna was confined to the royal palace at Tordesillas under protective custody, where she would remain for nearly 50 years. Her only companion, her daughter, Catalina. Her only identity, queen in name, ghost in practice. And for a time, the coffin remained there too, as if the dead king still presided, and she was merely waiting for the right moment to continue the journey. And maybe that was the most haunting part. She never really accepted that the journey was over. Modern historians debate the diagnosis. Was it schizophrenia? Bipolar disorder? A psychological breakdown rooted in trauma, isolation, and political betrayal? Maybe. Or maybe Joanna wasn't broken. Maybe she was simply too intact in her belief that love could conquer loss, even if it meant dragging death through the countryside in a velvet-lined wagon. There's something uncomfortably honest about her behavior, a refusal to move on, a refusal to pretend. A queen with a coffin who dared to keep mourning long after it became fashionable, and long after her court begged her to let go. But if Joanna's grief was about holding on to the one she lost, our next royal's obsession was the opposite. He didn't want the dead, he wanted the living. Tall, uniform, precise. Because for him, loyalty could be measured. Literally. In inches. Frederick William I of Prussia measured men for his giant regiment. Frederick William I of Prussia, nicknamed the Soldier King, wasn't the kind of monarch who adored ballrooms or basked in glittering court performances. He had no patience for lace, poetry, or courtly gossip. His tastes were simpler, leaner, colder. He preferred order over opulence, precision over pageantry, and above all else, height. Not philosophical height, literal height, as in tall men. Towering men, colossal, Prussian men. If you were a man standing over 6 feet tall in 18th century Europe, there was a non-zero chance you'd be invited to join the most absurd, meticulous, and bizarre royal vanity project in modern military history, Frederick William's Giant Regiment, or more formally, the Potsdam Grenadiers. A unit composed entirely of giants, measured, selected, drilled, and occasionally even bred for the purpose. To be clear, this was not a symbolic guard. This was not just some decorative troop of palace doormen. Frederick William poured enormous resources, time, money, diplomatic effort into creating and maintaining this regiment of height-endowed soldiers, and it was not a passing fancy. This was a daily obsession, a central preoccupation, a habit that bordered on the monastic. Every morning, the king would rise early, no royal indolence for him, and begin his routine of militarized inspection. One of his favorite rituals? Measuring soldiers, himself, with a ruler, sometimes with a measuring stick. No assistants, no aids. He enjoyed the act. He found comfort in the numbers, in the tangible certainty of inches and proportions. Other monarchs collected art. Frederick William collected altitude. He wasn't just looking for above average. He wanted the extreme, the overgrown, the prodigious. Any man over 6'3" became a subject of royal interest. Some joined willingly, promised prestige, and increased pay. Others were conscripted, persuaded less by offers and more by inevitability. In some cases, diplomatic gifts between kingdoms included exceptionally tall men. Ambassadors sent letters about height candidates. Kings traded soldiers the way other courts exchanged porcelain. One particularly strange episode involved an Austrian diplomat gifting a man over 7 feet tall as a gesture of goodwill. Frederick William was so delighted he ordered the man's silhouette painted and the image displayed in the guards' quarters. The man himself was paraded like a living monument to the king's priorities. But it didn't stop there. The king, dissatisfied with merely finding tall men, began arranging marriages between tall soldiers and tall women, hoping to breed a future generation of supersized troops. Eugenics, 18th century style. It was part courtly science, part romantic fantasy, part military-industrial daydream. And what did these giants do? Not much. They drilled. They stood guard. They walked in synchronized lines. They sometimes appeared in parades to impress visiting dignitaries. But they were never used in real combat, not once. Their size, so carefully curated, made them visually impressive but tactically awkward. They were fragile monuments, not tools. Expensive ceremonial toys. A kingdom of mannequins in full dress uniform. This is where the paradox sharpens. Frederick William I, a man famed for military frugality and austere governance, who slashed palace budgets, disbanded unnecessary courtiers, and avoided wars he didn't deem absolutely necessary, nonetheless poured staggering resources into maintaining a vanity project of zero strategic value. because the giant regiment wasn't about war, it was about control. It was geometry in human form, a walking architectural fantasy. Each soldier a column, each uniformed body a unit in the great symmetrical dream of the state. Frederick William didn't want chaos. He wanted symmetry, predictability, discipline you could see. And he loved them perhaps a little too much. He reportedly walked among the giants in private moments, admiring them, speaking to them with paternal fondness. Some accounts, likely exaggerated, claim he painted them in his leisure time, or had portraits made of his favourites. Others say he wept when one particularly tall soldier died. A strange intimacy hidden beneath the bark and brass of a militarized monarch. Of course, not everyone shared his affection. His son, Frederick the Great, would later roll his eyes at the entire endeavour, dismissing the regiment as his father's most irrational indulgence. He would eventually dissolve the unit. But the strange image of the soldier king remains, a monarch wandering through columns of giants, measuring, drilling, rearranging men like chess pieces he could actually count. There's something tragically funny about it all. A king obsessed with tallness in a world that was shrinking around him. A man who sought greatness not in ideas or victories, but in centimeters. He tried to build heaven with a yardstick, and yet even he slept at night. But the next king didn't tea. He didn't even live by day. He dined at midnight. He ruled by candlelight. And his most trusted advisor? Silence. Ludwig II of Bavaria, nocturnal king. At a time when most monarchs were rising with the sun, Ludwig II of Bavaria was just getting dressed by candlelight, in silence. For a meeting that no one else had been invited to with an imaginary guest, in a throne room he'd commissioned but never completed. His kingdom was not just Bavaria, it was twilight. Ludwig II was not insane, exactly. Not in the foaming at the mouth, Shakespearean tragedy sense. His madness, if we dare call it that, was architectural, operatic. It didn't shout, it shimmered. This was a man who built castles not to defend territory, but to echo music. A king who preferred swans to courtiers, clouds to ministers, solitude to speech. And perhaps most notably, he refused to operate on the same schedule as the rest of the human race. He reversed the hours of the day. He lived at night. Ludwig's daily life was a deliberate rejection of diurnal order. He would sleep through the daylight hours and awaken in the early evening, dining by moonlight and conducting business, what little he conducted by candelabra glow. Midnight was breakfast, sunrise was supper, and those around him, if they wanted to survive in his orbit, adapted accordingly. Ministers dozed in armchairs waiting for him to stir. Servants learned to whisper. Tailors worked by starlight. To Ludwig, this was not eccentricity. It was aesthetic necessity. Daylight was vulgar, common, exposing. The sun revealed the world as it was, with its jagged edges and inconvenient people. But the night was velvet. The night smoothed reality. It softened faces. It made fantasy possible. And Ludwig was in love with fantasy. He was Bavaria's king, yes, but he longed to be something far more elusive. A character in a Wagnerian opera. A tragic prince. A solitary knight. A man misunderstood, brooding atop a mountain in a castle of his own design. He didn't just appreciate the arts, he inhabited them. His imagination didn't supplement reality, it replaced it. He built palaces like stage sets. Neuschwanstein, his most famous creation, was less a home than a hallucination in stone. Perched in the Alps, it was a hybrid of medieval legend and 19th century kitsch, stuffed with murals, myth, and melancholy. Tourists today marvel at its fairy tale appearance. What they don't always realize is that it was never finished. Ludwig ran out of time and out of money. Back in the city, his audiences became increasingly bizarre. He began to hold late-night theatrical events where no one performed except for elaborately dressed tableaux. Frozen actors posed like living paintings. Ludwig would walk through the room alone, in silence, as if moving through a dream. His attendants knew better than to speak. Then there were the dinners served at hours closer to sunrise than sunset, often for one. The king would sit at an enormous candlelit table, surrounded by mirrors and opulence, his food brought in silently on a mechanical dumbwaiter so he wouldn't have to see the servants. Sometimes he imagined company. Sometimes he addressed absent figures. But the silence was never broken. He wrote rambling letters to Richard Wagner, his idol, patron, and frequent headache, professing admiration that blurred into obsession. He funded operas, stages, orchestras. He ignored wars. He ignored governance. His ministers, increasingly frantic, kept the machinery of the state running without him. They filed reports. He built another castle. Eventually, of course, it caught up to him. The debts ballooned, the court grew restless, and the government, fearing instability, fearing ridicule, declared Ludwig insane. The diagnosis was politically convenient and medically flimsy, but effective. In 1886, he was deposed and placed under arrest in his own palace. 3 days later, he was dead, found floating in shallow water next to his doctor, who also perished. No one knows exactly what happened. Theories range from suicide to murder to accident. The autopsy was inconclusive. The silence, fittingly, remains. Ludwig's life was a refusal not just of daylight, but of duty, of modernity, of shared time. He sought beauty so fiercely he abandoned the world that paid for it. A nocturnal monarch who chose imagination over administration, a sovereign who traded policy for poetry, governance for glowing glass chandeliers. The irony? His castles mocked his follies during his life became Bavaria's most beloved symbols. Tourists flocked by the millions. His debts were paid off by ticket sales. His delusions, so costly and strange in their time, became the nation's most photogenic legacy. But Ludwig never got to see it. He died before the dream was completed, before the world came around, before the sun finally rose on his legacy. Yet if Ludwig hid from the daylight, the next ruler did something even more unusual. She used it to disappear herself. Not through castles, but through clothing. Because the next queen didn't believe in categories at all. And her morning routine started with a sword and ended with a book. Christina of Sweden Daily Gender Nonconformist Presentation. In the age of powdered wigs and strict royal etiquette, Christina of Sweden woke up each morning and made a decision not to follow the rules. Not the rules of courtly beauty, not the expectations of queenship, not even the most basic assumptions about what women, especially royal women, were supposed to be. Her rebellion didn't require revolutions or battles. It required something more personal, more stubborn, more daily. The act of choosing what to wear and what not to become. She dressed in men's clothing, regularly, publicly, with no apology. Not as a passing whim or rare symbolic gesture, but as part of her normal wardrobe. Breeches instead of gowns. Boots instead of heels, swords instead of fans, her hair cut shorter, her movements sharper, and most importantly, her refusal to mask herself with powder, perfume, or the obligatory softness demanded of royal women at the time. This wasn't a theatrical performance, it was her life. Christina ascended the throne in 1632 at the age of 6, though she didn't begin ruling in her own right until her late teens. From the beginning, she was a puzzle to the European courtly imagination. She read constantly, ravenously. By her own admission, she often preferred books to people. She devoured philosophy, history, languages, science, theology. She held debates in her chambers, invited thinkers and artists to her court, and famously corresponded with René Descartes, whom she eventually persuaded to visit Stockholm. He died there, not long after arriving. Some joked the Swedish cold killed him. Others whispered it was the Queen's relentless curiosity that did it. Every day for Christina began with more than just breakfast or grooming. It began with asserting control over her identity. She deliberately spurned the trappings of femininity. She resisted coronation for years, loathing the idea of being locked into symbolic womanhood. When she finally did accept the crown, it was on her own terms, wearing armour beneath her ceremonial gown and standing so still she seemed sculpted, not crowned. The court was scandalised, the foreign ambassadors confused. Reports varied. Some described her as eccentric, others as unwell, many as simply indecipherable. But Christina never seemed concerned with how she was perceived. She was far more interested in how she perceived herself. She structured her schedule around reading and solitude, hunting and fencing, deep philosophical inquiry. She spent hours a day in study. She often wore a sword strapped to her side, symbolic, yes, but also practical. Her movements were crisp, her voice reportedly deep, her presence commanding. She rejected conventional beauty rituals, and her refusal to marry became a source of endless speculation. Here is where the image sharpens. Christina walking briskly through the palace, cloak trailing behind her, sword tapping rhythmically against her boots. Eyebrows furrowed from an all-night debate with a theologian, dismissing a diplomat because she had more urgent metaphysical concerns. It sounds like a fable. It wasn't. It was her morning routine. In many ways, she was centuries ahead of her time. We would now use terms like gender nonconformity, perhaps even queer identity, to describe her presentation. But Christina had no such words. She had only herself and a kingdom that expected a bride, a ruler, a symbol. Instead, they got a scholar, a philosopher, and a rebel. Eventually, she made a decision that shocked Europe. She abdicated. In 1654, after years of resisting marriage, court protocol, and religious conformity, she stepped down, publicly, dramatically. She passed the crown to her cousin, left Sweden in men's clothing, and converted to Catholicism in Italy, abandoning not just her throne, but the entire worldview that had defined her upbringing. It was not a collapse. It was a relocation, a quiet rebellion that unfolded one refusal at a time. She would go on to live in Rome, where she carved out a strange, independent life patron of the arts, confidant to cardinals, a queen without a country, dressed like a man, thinking like a philosopher, living like no one else dared. Was she mad? Many said so, but the records suggest otherwise. She was lucid, intelligent, intensely self-aware, and more than anything, she was uninterested in being something she was not. That was her habit, her daily routine, her resistance. Not a shout, not a war, but a quiet, persistent choice. To wear the wrong clothes, to refuse the right marriage, to say no to a crown that came with too many strings. And while Christina spent her mornings sharpening her mind, another royal far south in Spain spent his mornings refusing to leave bed at all. Because when your body becomes your prison, even the crown can't lift you. Philip V of Spain stayed in bed for days. Some kings conquer, others legislate. Some obsess over grandeur, warfare, or ritual. Philip V of Spain mostly lay down for days, sometimes weeks, A monarch with absolute power, commanding an empire that stretched across continents, who often found himself unable to rise, dress, or speak. He was not lazy. He was not indifferent. He was afflicted, haunted, locked in place by what modern minds might recognize as profound clinical depression, though. At the time, the Spanish court could only call it melancholia and tiptoe around it in hushed tones. The spectacle of a sovereign who would not leave his bed, who refused to groom himself or address matters of state, became one of the strangest and saddest routines in royal history. At the height of his illness, Philip would spend entire days under the covers, fully dressed or completely naked depending on his mood, staring at the ceiling in silence. Ministers arrived with documents requiring signature. He ignored them. Servants tried to coax him with breakfast, music, or carefully staged appeals to duty. He remained still. Queen Elisabeth Farnese, his second wife and a formidable political figure in her own right, often served as unofficial regent during these episodes, delicately navigating between palace rituals and the increasingly volatile mental state of her husband. It wasn't always like this. Philip had come to the Spanish throne in 1700, the first Bourbon king of Spain and grandson of Louis XIV of France. He was young, energetic, and strategically placed at the center of Europe's dynastic chessboard. His claim to the Spanish crown sparked the War of Spanish Succession, a massive geopolitical crisis. But once settled, his reign had the makings of a classic royal career. Consolidate power, manage colonial wealth, expand influence. And for a while, he did. But by the 1722nd, things began to unravel. Philip's behavior became erratic, unpredictable. His moods sank into deep troughs. He developed what might now be understood as obsessive-compulsive symptoms. He became overwhelmed by religious guilt. At times, he refused to bathe or change his clothes. He fixated on the end of the world. He claimed he could hear voices or feared eternal damnation, but the most consistent symptom was his refusal to get out of bed. He didn't sleep. He lay awake, endlessly, not dreaming, but simply being. Passive, paralyzed. At times, he would mutter religious phrases under his breath. Other times, nothing at all. He reportedly once lay motionless for so long that courtiers feared he had died. When a servant touched his shoulder to check, Philip responded by shouting a long Latin prayer and then resumed his silence. This pattern repeated itself in cycles. For days, the government would grind to a halt as officials hovered at the edge of the royal bedroom, waiting for Philip to stir. When he finally did, it was often followed by bursts of manic energy. He would sign dozens of decrees in a flurry, hold multiple audiences, or suddenly take an interest in military affairs, only to collapse back into catatonia the next week. In a strange way, Philip governed like a fever chart. His moments of lucidity were sharp, sometimes brilliant, but his lows were profound, untouchable, and deeply unnerving to everyone around him. His courtiers began to plan state functions around his mood. Some days, the only way to get through to him was via music. His court musicians were on constant call, summoned to the royal bedchamber with violins and harpsichords. At other times, priests were ushered in, expected to coax the king toward some semblance of function through prayer. None of it was reliable. And then, in 1724, he did something that sent a wave of confusion across Europe. He abdicated, willingly. He handed the throne to his 7-year-old son, Louis, and retired. Most assumed he had finally given in to his illness. Perhaps he recognized his unfitness to rule. But then, only 7 months later, his son died suddenly of smallpox. And Philip returned, reclaiming the crown, resuming power, as if nothing had happened. The bed, however, remained his true throne. His condition worsened in his later years. He grew increasingly detached, relying heavily on Elisabeth to manage court life. His periods of withdrawal lengthened. The royal staff developed a complex, unsustainable routine of bedside governance, where officials would kneel by the mattress with documents and read them aloud, hoping for a nod or a grunt of approval. Some ministers began forging his assent. Philip died in 1746 after a reign that spanned nearly half a century on and off. He left behind not a trail of war or conquest, but a memory of absence, a legacy of horizontal power. His governance was not marked by speeches, but by silence. Not presence, but vacancy. Not strength, but stillness. And while Philip's bed became his battlefield, another emperor crafted a very different kind of war room. One filled not with blankets and confessionals, but with bubbling flasks, glowing symbols, and whispers of the arcane. Because in the next palace, alchemists ruled the clock, and the emperor preferred the company of stars and secrets. Rudolf II, Holy Roman Emperor, Court of Alchemists. Some emperors build roads, others reform laws. Rudolf II built a labyrinth of curiosities, crammed it with dreamers, schemers, and pseudo-scientists, and called it a court. While the rest of Europe edged cautiously toward the Enlightenment, Rudolf stepped boldly in the opposite direction into the murky, candlelit world of astrology, alchemy, mysticism, and men with wild eyes who swore they could transmute lead into gold. He ruled the Holy Roman Empire from the Habsburg throne in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. But ruled may be a generous word. Presided over might be better. Or watched through a telescope while forgetting to answer letters. Rudolf's daily habits didn't resemble governance so much as an extended occult retreat, equal parts laboratory, salon, and asylum. His court in Prague was not a place of orderly administration. It was a theatre of the weird, a cabinet of obsessions made political. On any given day, you could find court astrologers casting horoscopes for international treaties, engineers building impossible machines powered by moonlight, or metallurgists in smoky basements mixing mercury with the king's money in hopes of divine transformation. Every hallway in his palace was a corridor of speculation. Every whisper, a secret formula. Every hour, an act of ceremonial wonder. Rudolf's habit, his defining royal quirk, wasn't a single act, but a daily lifestyle of compulsive inquiry. His interests ranged from astronomy to magic, from collecting exotic animals to commissioning elaborate mechanical clocks. And all of it, every book, every tool, every specimen was placed in his ever-expanding Kunstkammer, or cabinet of curiosities, a private museum of marvels that served as both mirror and maze of his mind. He began his day not with ministers, but with mystics. Where another ruler might rise to discuss matters of tax or war, Rudolf invited philosophers to debate the soul's properties, or requested readings of ancient texts on the properties of flame. It wasn't that he was lazy, he worked obsessively, but the work was internal, esoteric, governed more by planetary motion than parliamentary rule. He was, in some sense, trying to build a cosmic empire, a dominion that reached not just across lands, but across the veil between known and unknown. He kept the likes of John Dee, the English mystic and mathematician, and Tycho Brahe, the astronomer with a prosthetic nose and a pet elk. He hosted painters like Giuseppe Arcimboldo, who made portraits out of fruit, fish, and flowers. Literal visual riddles that perfectly suited the emperor's taste for surreal beauty. And yet, despite this dense fog of ritualized curiosity, The empire itself was slipping. While Rudolf catalogued unicorn horns and celestial charts, his territories suffered from administrative neglect, economic strain, and increasing religious instability. He refused to engage in decisive action. His ministers waited weeks for responses. Some matters were simply left to decay, like experiments abandoned mid-boil. Rudolf's obsession with alchemy went beyond mere metaphor. He truly believed the world could be purified, that base metals could become noble ones, that the soul could ascend through study. He personally collected hundreds of alchemical manuscripts and kept teams of practitioners in his service. Glass vials, alembics, and crucibles filled his private chambers. Some accounts describe the emperor himself trying his hand at mixing strange tinctures, searching for the philosopher's stone not as a symbol, but as a solvable puzzle. But the philosopher's stone never arrived. Gold never appeared. And slowly, Rudolf began to crumble emotionally, politically, and physically. He withdrew more and more, became reclusive, spoke only to his chosen few, refused to see ambassadors. At times, he reportedly spoke to statues, consulted horoscopes before answering simple questions, and insisted on astrological charts before meetings. The palace lights flickered longer into the night. The corridors grew quieter. Ministers muttered. His brother Matthias, frustrated by the drift, eventually seized control of portions of the empire. Rudolf was gently sidelined while still technically in charge. He died in 1612, surrounded not by generals or statesmen, but by artists, books, and boxes of preserved animal organs. His cabinet of curiosities, once the envy of European collectors, was slowly dismantled, sold, or looted in the conflicts that followed. And yet, what he left behind wasn't a legacy of failure. It was a strange, fragile beauty, a glimpse of what happens when a monarch decides the world isn't big enough and instead tries to rule the invisible. In a way, Rudolf governed like an alchemist himself, endlessly transforming, combining, distilling, but never quite arriving. And like all true alchemists, he died just a little too soon to see whether it ever would have worked. But while Rudolf tried to manipulate the soul through knowledge and flame, another emperor was pursuing immortality by more dangerous means. Not through magic, through medicine, swallowed in silver, and always sleeping somewhere else. Qin Shi Huang slept in different rooms and took mercury elixirs. Most rulers fear assassination. Qin Shi Huang, first emperor of a unified China, feared everything. He didn't sleep in the same place 2 nights in a row. He rarely told his staff where he would rest until the last possible moment. He built hidden passageways beneath his palaces and travelled with decoys. But above all, he feared death. And so, he chased immortality relentlessly, ritualistically, and with the kind of single-minded conviction that only empires can afford. His habits weren't eccentric. They were systemic, engineered. Every movement, every dose, every swallow of alchemical liquid was part of a daily attempt to escape mortality. He was not trying to live longer. He was trying to outwit death, not metaphorically, logistically. To understand how deeply this routine governed Qin Shi Huang's life, you have to begin with the idea of control. As the man who forged modern China out of the warring states, he was obsessed with centralization. One script, one system of measurement, one legal code, one empire, one emperor. And once he had achieved all that, something no one had done before, he couldn't bear the thought of letting it go. Death, therefore, wasn't natural. It was rebellion. He reacted accordingly. The most infamous habit, of course, was his regular ingestion of so-called immortality elixirs concocted by imperial alchemists who combined cinnabar, gold dust, powdered jade, and most significantly, mercury. At the time, these substances were thought to contain life-preserving or life-extending properties. Cinnabar, a mercury sulfide compound, glowed red, shimmered with power, and crucially was poisonous. But to the emperor, poison was relative. What mattered was promise. His medical regimen became ritualized. Tinctures and pills were taken daily. Meals were carefully curated for balance. The imperial physicians wrote long formulaic reports describing the elixir's harmonizing effects on the emperor's qi. Anyone who questioned the routine didn't remain in the routine. And while the mercury slowly poisoned his body, causing tremors, paranoia, and cognitive decline, his behavioral habits became even more extreme. He ceased sleeping in any fixed location. The imperial palace was filled with dozens of chambers, all suitable for a monarch, none of them reliably occupied. Only a select few servants knew where he would sleep on a given night, and they were forbidden from speaking of it. Even they were often told at the last minute. Security was absolute. Predictability was weakness. After all, how can death find you if no one knows where you are? He travelled with entire retinues of body doubles. He kept astrologers busy day and night, consulting omens for even the smallest movement. He once halted an entire state procession because a thunderclap occurred during a change in direction interpreted, naturally, as a sign of mortal danger. Some might call it superstition, but for Qin Shi Huang, it was just smart governance. His fear of death wasn't abstract, it was logistical, like a threat vector to be mapped and eliminated. And so his habits became a kind of defensive programming. Never stay in one place, never expose your routine, never go to sleep with assumptions. But perhaps the most striking symbol of this obsession is what he left behind. The terracotta army. Thousands of life-size statues, each with unique facial features, uniforms, and weapons, buried beneath the earth to guard him in the afterlife. This wasn't just art. It was military planning. Even his after-death existence was mapped with defenses, generals, horses, and battalions. He prepared for the next world like a man prepping for a civil war. Ironically, the very rituals he believed would protect him, the mercury elixirs, the secrecy, the exhaustive security, contributed directly to his death. Historical records suggest he died suddenly during a tour of the empire, his body quietly transported back in a wagon filled with rotting fish to mask the smell of decomposition. In his final moments, surrounded by maps, scrolls, decoys, and poison disguised as salvation, Qin Shi Huang failed to outrun the one opponent no emperor has yet conquered. Death, quiet and unimpressed, found him anyway. But the question remains, did he ever truly believe he was immortal? Or did he simply refuse to acknowledge the alternative? Because to admit death, for a man who had unified 1,000 years of warring chaos, was to admit that his control had limits. And for Qin Shi Huang, limits were the one thing he'd spent his entire life eliminating. His daily rituals weren't madness, they were ideology, they were architecture. The same mind that standardized writing across China also believed that secrecy and mercury could hold off decay. The same hand that drafted legal codes also reached out, daily, for another shimmering vial. And while his sleeping chambers changed every night, one thing stayed the same, the hope that morning would come without cost. But not every emperor feared death. Some embraced the night and whispered to it. Because the next Roman didn't run from the moon. He spoke to it. Caligula talked to the moon. The Roman emperor, Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, known to the world by his childhood nickname, Caligula, ruled for just 4 years. But in that time, he produced a body of strange and unsettling habits that have echoed through history like the fading laughter of a very bored god. And among the strangest, most quietly unnerving of them all, he talked to the moon. Not poetically, not metaphorically, not in wistful odes or dramatic speeches from balconies. Caligula is reported to have held one-sided conversations with the moon goddess, Luna, late at night, walking alone through the halls of his palace or standing on the colonnades, speaking into the empty sky like it might answer back. To his courtiers, it was one more item on a growing list of imperial behaviors that shimmered between performance and illusion. Of course, it wasn't just talk. Caligula treated the moon not as scenery, but as presence. He believed the moon was alive, a witness, possibly a companion, and according to some ancient biographers, occasionally an enemy. On certain nights, when the moon shone too brightly or rose too late, he is said to have taken it as a personal insult. On others, he stood on the palace roof, arms raised, as if delivering a formal address to the sky. This wasn't harmless eccentricity. It was ritual. The kind of ritual that grows slowly into routine. And in a palace already drowning in theatricality, cruelty, and arbitrary displays of power, the moon conversations were perhaps the quietest warning sign of all. The emperor had stopped speaking to people and started speaking past them. To fully understand why this habit was so unsettling to ancient Roman society, you have to remember what the moon represented. In Roman religion, Luna was more than just a celestial object. She was a deity, associated with mystery, cycles, and the often female-coded realm of the unseen. She belonged to the night, to omens, to madness. For a Roman emperor, especially a male emperor, raised on military tradition to engage with her so personally blurred multiple lines. It crossed into the feminine, the divine, the irrational. It challenged not just decorum, but cosmology. And yet, it fit. Because everything Caligula did seemed designed to test limits. He didn't rule Rome so much as dare it to flinch. He is perhaps most famous for his more explosive behaviors, appointing his horse as priest and possibly senator, demanding to be worshipped as a living god, conducting lavish public games in the midst of famine, executing nobles on whims, and allegedly turning the imperial palace into a kind of debauched theatre. But the moon habit reveals something deeper, something more personal. Because, unlike public executions or circus displays, the moon talks were private, intimate. Rituals of isolation. They suggest a man not just obsessed with power, but adrift in it. According to Suetonius and Cassius Dio, two ancient sources who clearly loathed him, Caligula suffered from insomnia, chronic, hallucinatory, mind-warping sleeplessness. He would wander the palace at night, unable to rest, disturbed by visions and sounds no one else could hear. In that half-lit state, the moon became his companion. A celestial confidant for a man who no longer trusted or even recognized the people around him. He spoke to the moon because it was the only thing in Rome that didn't argue back. And what did he say? We don't know. The records, tinged with bias, are maddeningly vague. But some speculate he believed the moon's cycles affected his fate, that Luna herself judged his decisions, that the Emperor of Rome had entered into a kind of nightly dialogue with the divine, not through priests or temples, but directly, bypassing the earthly world entirely. Even his most loyal supporters began to fear him, not for his cruelty they'd adjusted to that, but for his growing distance from reality. Talking to the moon wasn't just strange, it was lonely. It revealed a man who had all the power in the world and no one left to talk to. A ruler who had turned the empire into a mirror and still couldn't find himself in it. Eventually, It caught up with him. He was assassinated at age 28 by his own guards in a corridor of the palace he once stalked by moonlight. No divine intervention, no lunar rescue, just steel, silence, and, presumably, a full moon rising somewhere above Rome. But the image remains. Caligula, alone at night, speaking into the stars. A king not content to rule the earth, but who needed the heavens to pay attention. Or perhaps, in the final twist of irony, he spoke to the moon because it was the only part of his kingdom he didn't control. And while he whispered to the sky, another emperor just a few decades later would make his voice echo in daylight, not through policy, not through conquest, but through song. Loud, long, and unavoidable. Nero daily performer. If Caligula talked to the moon in private, his great-nephew and spiritual successor, Nero, chose a different route. He performed, constantly, publicly, aggressively. For Nero, being emperor wasn't enough. He wanted to be seen, and not in the military sense, not through decrees or edicts, but through applause. Not just heard, but cheered. Not just obeyed, but adored. Preferably with standing ovations. So he did what any narcissist with a global platform might do. He staged himself. Literally. Every day. Nero didn't just dabble in music. He didn't just enjoy poetry. He didn't perform occasionally to amuse a court or entertain a delegation. He made art into obligation, turned performance into policy. Singing, acting, lyre playing, verse reciting, these weren't hobbies, they were the imperial calendar. From the moment he took power in AD 54, Nero began reshaping Rome in his own theatrical image. The palaces became stages, the court an audience, and the empire one big amphitheater. His days were organized around rehearsals, costuming, and musical instruction. Professional musicians were hired not to entertain him, but to train him. He even had his own vocal coach, who reportedly insisted that Nero follow strict dietary regimens and practice vocal warm-ups, sometimes involving bizarre methods like lying on his back with a lead weight on his chest to improve breath control. And all of this was taken as seriously, if not more so, than matters of governance. Performances were scheduled regularly. At first, they were modest. A few trusted courtiers, a song or two. But then the scale increased. Nero began performing publicly in the theatre. He played Greek tragedies, sang epic poems, acted out scenes where gods wept and kings begged for mercy, usually played by himself. Roman nobles were forced to attend, sometimes for hours on end. Leaving early was risky. Falling asleep was punishable. Applause was not optional. Ancient historians Suetonius, Tacitus, Cassius Dio report that noble women faked childbirth to escape his performances. Senators pretended to faint. Some even died in the middle of a show, but the doors were locked and the emperor refused to stop. He would sing entire sagas hours long until the audience wept with exhaustion or feigned ecstasy just to make it end. But for Nero, this wasn't ego, this was legacy. He believed himself a divine artist, a reincarnation of Apollo, a vessel of culture. He declared that emperors were not just warriors and rulers, they were creators. That governance without beauty was brutality, that music could bind the empire in ways armies could not. It sounds poetic. Until you realize his art became a daily form of imperial hostage-taking. He even left Rome to tour Greece, participating in competitions at the Olympic Games and other ancient festivals. These events, formerly sacred to the gods and free citizens, were suddenly overrun by Roman security forces and imperial decorators. Nero competed in poetry, music, and chariot racing. He won everything. Naturally, not because he was good, though he was reportedly adequate, but because he was emperor. His victories were announced before the events began. Statues were erected in his honor. Crowns were placed on his head. Entire cities were renamed after him. Back in Rome, the line between ruler and celebrity evaporated. Nero built the Domus Aurea, his golden house, a sprawling, gaudy, gold-leafed monstrosity of a palace designed more like a theater set than a home. It featured an enormous rotating dining room that simulated the movement of the heavens. Paintings of mythological scenes featuring Nero, of course, lined the walls. Perfumed fountains misted guests. Every hallway echoed with the anticipation of performance. Behind the glitz, however, things were falling apart. The economy strained under the weight of imperial vanity. The Senate was sidelined. The army grew restless. The people initially charmed began to sour, especially after the Great Fire of Rome in AD 64. Rumors quickly spread that Nero had ordered it himself to make room for his new palace, and that while the city burned, he sang from a balcony an image so provocative that it still lingers today, even if it's probably not true. But the perception stuck. The emperor as performer, Rome as stage, disaster as backdrop. Eventually, his need for adoration consumed him. Anyone who didn't applaud loudly enough was suspect. Senators were executed. Poets were silenced. Even his own mother was eliminated when she stopped clapping. And in the end, when rebellion finally caught up with him, and Rome turned against its actor king, Nero's last recorded words were not about his empire, his legacy, or his crimes. They were theatrical. Qualis artifex perio. What an artist dies in me. Because Nero believed, to the very end, that he wasn't just a ruler. He was a performance. And Rome, whether it liked it or not, was his captive audience. But while Nero chased eternal applause, another French king retreated into amulets and omens, his kingdom governed not by song, but by superstition. Because when logic failed, Louis XI reached for the stars and a rabbit's foot. Louis XI of France talismans and astrologers. In the palaces of 15th century France, amid crumbling Gothic stone and echoing council halls, a king ruled not by charm or vision, but by twitchy calculation and a pocket full of charms. Louis XI, the so-called Spider King of France, was not grand. He was not inspiring. He was not loved. But he was alive, something he managed, in his view, not through politics or God, but through the strategic deployment of talismans, omens, and an entire cottage industry of astrologers. Most monarchs claimed divine right. Louis XI acted more like he had a suspicious arrangement with the supernatural and wasn't taking any chances. He wore religious medals and lucky charms like chainmail. Each morning began with ritual touch points, amulets for protection, relics for vision, and specially folded papers stuffed with sacred phrases, tucked into pockets, belts, boots. His clothing was layered not for fashion or warmth, but for shielding, physical and spiritual. He didn't merely believe in astrology, he lived by it. He consulted horoscopes before decisions, altered plans based on lunar cycles, and delayed meetings because of planetary alignments. His court astrologers were among the most powerful men in his orbit. They didn't advise, they warned. And Louis listened. Whenever he felt threatened, he didn't call a general, he called a priest, and then an astrologer, and maybe a man who claimed to talk to snakes. He wasn't interested in moral clarity or theological precision. He was interested in survival. That was his central obsession, more than justice, more than territory, more than legacy. Louis XI wanted to keep breathing. And if that meant keeping a taxidermied rabbit's foot sewn into his cloak, So be it. His court mocked him, of course, quietly, behind doors. They whispered about the relics, the coded prayers, the letters scrawled with holy abbreviations, the sudden outbursts of fear over invisible forces. But they also feared him, because superstition, in Louis's hands, didn't look weak, it looked strategic. He used fear the way other kings used armies. He didn't just protect himself from curses, he threatened others with them. Executions were sometimes timed to coincide with eclipses. Public humiliations were staged to mimic mythic punishments. When negotiating treaties, he might reference the stars instead of the terms. Confusing, disarming, effective. He was deeply religious, but not in the devout, ceremonial sense. His religion was instrumental. Saints were soldiers, angels were operatives, relics were magical tech. The Virgin Mary wasn't a divine mother, she was a celestial insurance policy. And then there were his shrines. Louis XI built or endowed dozens of small chapels, each staffed with monks instructed to pray for his personal safety. Not the kingdom, not the soul of France, his own neck. He ordered masses to be said in cycles, ensuring a constant stream of intercessory prayer. The monks became living alarms. If prayers faltered, who knew what could happen? This daily paranoia bled into governance. He surrounded himself with spies, executed nobles who lingered too close to rival astrologers, and avoided long-term commitments unless the stars were favorable. His policies were cold, bureaucratic, and often brilliant, but they never felt quite human, because they weren't. They were calculated moves in a cosmic chess game. To the people, he was invisible, rarely seen, rarely heard. He travelled in secret, wore modest clothes, and cultivated an image not of grandeur, but of quiet, terrifying inevitability. He wasn't the king who dazzled. He was the king who showed up at midnight with a parchment, a holy medal, and a threat. By the end of his life, his health failed, but his rituals only intensified. He became a recluse, living in a fortified manor where he built a private oratory stuffed with relics. Priests rotated in shifts. Incense burned constantly. Prayers echoed through the halls, even when he slept. He had made his body a battlefield, and his schedule a shield. He had survived decades of war, betrayal, rebellion, and in his mind, he owed it all to the rabbit's foot, the stars, and 1,000 whispered prayers. And yet, no matter how many talismans he wore, time crept in. Death, of course, did not care about astrologers. But the next ruler did, and in a far stranger way. He didn't consult the stars. He enforced the length of sideburns. Paul I of Russia Uniform Police. Paul! I didn't need omens to feel unsafe. Born into suspicion, raised on the edges of power, and ultimately crowned with 1,000 silent enemies in the room, Paul entered his reign with one hand on the scepter and the other tightening a belt, your belt, specifically because Paul I of Russia had a habit that made him famous across St. Petersburg. He policed uniforms, personally, obsessively, with the fervor of a man who thought mismatched buttons might summon the apocalypse. He would ride through the streets unannounced in full military attire, inspecting pedestrians like they were failed statues. Sideburns too long? Arrested. Hat at the wrong angle? Dismissed. Boots unshined? Punishment. He was not joking. He once demoted a high-ranking officer for daring to wear a grey overcoat instead of regulation green. This wasn't eccentricity, it was imperial policy. Paul viewed the uniform as the skin of the state. To disrespect it even slightly was to threaten the entire Russian order. His daily life became a meticulous parade of measurements, angles, fabrics, and shouts. He redesigned the military dress code himself down to the shape of cuffs and the stiffness of collars. Soldiers fainted during drills from the tightness of the necks. Officers carried spare gloves in case of surprise inspections. Whole regiments feared his morning walks more than enemy armies. And he didn't stop at soldiers. Civilians were subject to the same scrutiny. Public servants, merchants, even children at state schools. Everyone was expected to model imperial precision. He issued thousands of decrees, many focused on clothing. One year it was epaulets, the next, hat brims. He mandated specific walking speeds for guards, standardized greetings, regulated facial expressions. Some were satire-proof in their ridiculousness. Others had teeth. Disobedience meant prison or worse. Behind it all was paranoia. Paul's mother, Catherine the Great, had kept him distant from power. He grew up watching her rule a vast empire without him. When he finally took the throne in 1796, he was determined to prove control, but instead of reforming institutions, he micromanaged appearances. His obsession with uniforms was about more than aesthetics. It was about obedience, predictability. If he could get everyone to dress the same, maybe they'd stop betraying him. Each morning, Paul would inspect his guards personally. He rose early, dressed in full regalia, and launched into surprise drills. He was known to change entire regiments' duties based on how neatly their boots were laced. Some soldiers developed chronic injuries from the stiffness of their uniforms, but dared not complain. Court life, once vibrant and indulgent under Catherine, became tense and twitchy. Conversation stopped when he entered a room. Nobles joked behind closed doors, but never within earshot. Diplomats from Europe reported back to their governments that the Russian court had become unreadable. And in that unreadability, Paul found comfort. He trusted few. His edicts became erratic. He reversed Catherine's policies out of spite. He alienated the nobility. But every day, he kept the uniforms crisp, the pants tucked, the faces clean-shaven. His world made sense as long as it looked neat. Until, of course, it didn't. In 1801, a group of nobles and officers broke into his bedroom and assassinated him. Some wore their full uniforms. His son, Alexander I, would later describe Paul's reign as a storm in velvet. But if Paul tried to micromanage power through clothing, the next emperor needed no outfit at all. Just a quiet room, a still hand, and a fly. Domitian fly stabbing to pass the time. In the late Roman Empire, power often came wrapped in silence, and nothing illustrated that silence more chillingly than the habit of Emperor Domitian, who reportedly passed idle palace hours stabbing flies. Not ordering executions, not plotting reforms, just sitting in isolation, a stylus or pen in hand, killing flies. It sounds like a joke, but it was repeated by multiple Roman sources, most notably Suetonius, who claimed that when someone once asked if the emperor was receiving anyone, a servant replied, "No, he's alone killing flies." There's something quietly terrifying about that. Not the violence, it's just flies, after all, but the deliberateness. The image of an emperor, supreme ruler of the known world, seated in near silence with nothing to do and all the power in the world, carefully, repetitively, ending the brief lives of creatures too small to notice him. It wasn't madness, exactly. It was control, a performance of dominance. He could have done anything. Instead, he killed what was weakest, what couldn't resist, what simply landed in his presence. And tomorrow he'll do it again. Because when gods grow bored, the buzzing gets louder. Charles XII of Sweden, soldier-monk routine. Charles XII of Sweden, ruled like a man who had no use for palaces, perfumes, or pillows. He was a king with battlefield instincts, monastery discipline, and a daily routine that bordered on asceticism. While most royals held court from velvet thrones and waxed poetic over elaborate banquets, Charles slept in his boots, literally. Most nights, he didn't even remove his uniform, and that wasn't due to crisis or travel. That was his schedule. Nicknamed the Lion of the North, Charles XII came to power in 1697, just a teenager, but already allergic to the performance of royalty. He was deeply Lutheran, deeply private, and alarmingly obsessed with the idea of embodying a warrior ideal not in stories, but in flesh. His habits weren't just shaped by war, they were sculpted in it. War wasn't a chapter in his reign. It was the reign. Charles led military campaigns across Eastern Europe, often in brutally cold terrain, fighting against Russia, Poland, Saxony, and others in the Great Northern War. But unlike many rulers who watched battles from gilded carriages or remote villas, Charles fought in the mud with his soldiers, ate the same rations, slept on the same ground, woke to the same bugle. Over time, he adopted a lifestyle so rigorously Spartan that it seemed designed not just for efficiency, but for suffering. He refused to sleep in comfort. Whether in a tent, a makeshift barrack, or a palace offered by a defeated enemy, he would lie down fully clothed, sword at his side, boots on, coat buttoned to the throat. It wasn't out of paranoia, it was principle. He believed a soldier should always be ready, and as far as Charles was concerned, he was a soldier first and a king second. This wasn't temporary. For years, it was his life, day in, day out. He kept a monastic diet. Bread, cheese, and water were staples, even when more luxurious meals were prepared for him. He declined them, not for health reasons, for discipline. To enjoy luxury was to soften, and softness, he believed, would invite ruin. His courtiers struggled to keep up. They would often wake in the night to find him already up, pacing, praying, or writing dispatches. He imposed military drills even during peacetime, and his disdain for ceremony extended to diplomacy. He once refused a royal feast in favor of solitary cold rations and made his diplomatic guests eat standing up. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of his routine was its consistency. Even in the cold of Russian winters, even during retreats, defeats, and long campaigns, Charles adhered to his strict schedule. No velvet-lined command tents, no ornate bathtubs, no frilly silk robes. Just the same uniform, worn threadbare, patched and repatched, until it resembled something closer to a relic than a royal garment. His enemies were baffled. Russian envoys wrote home describing Charles as inhumanly disciplined. Even Peter the Great, who wasn't exactly known for luxury, found Charles's habits severe. After his disastrous invasion of Russia, Charles spent years in exile in the Ottoman Empire. Even there, surrounded by opportunity for indulgence, he refused it all. He maintained his routines, rejected luxuries, and lived like a monk with a musket. The Turkish court was so confused by his behavior that they began to see him as a holy warrior or possibly cursed. When he finally returned to Sweden, it was only to launch more campaigns, more marches, more Spartan living. His life was one long rejection of comfort, and he never flinched. He died, appropriately, in battle shot in the head while inspecting trenches at the siege of Frederickston in 1718, fully clothed, boots on, sword ready. His court mourned, but they didn't clean out his chambers. There wasn't much to clean. A narrow bed, a few uniforms, a Bible, some maps. It wasn't a royal suite, it was a cell. And for Charles, that was enough. Because while most monarchs looked like kings and lived like nobles, Charles XII looked like a soldier and lived like a ghost barely present, always ready, never at rest. And while Charles rejected perfume, pomp, and superstition, another queen made them her signature scent. She wore gloves soaked in mystery, and ruled with a hand scented, possibly in poison, Catherine de' Medici. Perfumed gloves and poison cabinet. If Charles XII of Sweden lived like a ghost, Catherine de' Medici ruled like a shadow. She didn't need armies, she had astrologers. She didn't need threats, she had rumors. And she didn't need steel. She had gloves fine, perfumed, and possibly lethal. Catherine was Queen Consort of France in the 16th century, and later Queen Mother to 3 successive kings. But titles only tell part of the story. Her real power came from presence, a daily performance of influence, subtlety, and control. She wasn't just part of the French court, she was the French court, or at least its engine. Her mornings began with ritual, not just prayer or correspondence, but chemistry. Catherine had an apothecary, not in the general court sense, but a personal, discreet one trained in the art of blending perfumes, herbs, and, allegedly, poisons. She was obsessed with scent, but not just as beauty, as strategy. Perfume was a weapon. Scent could entrance, disarm, intimidate. Visitors were met with carefully curated aromas, each tailored to mood and occasion. Her gloves, elegant and custom-made, were infused with oils and chemicals. Some said they calmed, others said they concealed, and in at least one infamous case, they may have killed. The story goes that Catherine gifted a pair of gloves to Jeanne d'Albret, the Huguenot Queen of Navarre. Jeanne wore them. Days later, she was dead. Officially, it was illness. Unofficially, everyone whispered the same thing. The gloves. Catherine, of course, denied everything. There was no proof. But that was her brilliance. She didn't need proof. She needed doubt. And doubt was her currency. Her cabinet, part apothecary, part laboratory, part rumour mill, was the most closely guarded room in the palace. Vials, herbs, powders, and tinctures lined its walls. Some were medicines, some were perfumes, and some were ambiguous. Catherine believed in control through chemistry, but also through ambiguity. A poison is only effective if someone believes you'll use it. She was also deeply invested in astrology. Her court astrologer, Cosimo Ruggeri, advised her on nearly everything. The stars were consulted for weddings, wars, and even curtain colour. People laughed quietly, but they didn't ignore her, because Catherine's predictions had a way of being accurate, or becoming accurate, or, perhaps, being made accurate by unseen hands. She held midnight meetings. She wore black years before it was fashionable. She walked silently through the halls, often without attendants, arriving at rooms no one expected her to visit. She cultivated unpredictability. Her court was a theatre of suspicion, and she was the director. Her reputation was not helped by the infamous Street Bartholomew's Day massacre, in which thousands of Protestants were killed in coordinated violence across France. Catherine was accused, never directly proven, of orchestrating it. Some said she planned it weeks in advance. Others believed she merely let it happen. Either way, her fingerprints were invisible, but present. And her daily life continued, as ever. Gloves on, perfume wafting, eyes sharp. Even into old age, she retained her habits. Her medical cabinet expanded. Her choice of scent became darker, more bitter. She attended executions, not publicly, but near enough to witness. She sat through diplomatic meetings without blinking. She died at 69, still calculating, still feared, still mythologized. Whether she ever actually poisoned anyone is almost beside the point. Her reputation did the work. The scent of her gloves became more powerful than their material. Her image, cloaked in silk and shadow, lingered longer than any throne. And where Catherine manipulated the senses, the next royal manipulated something more primal, guilt. He didn't threaten you. He weighed you. Before and after dinner, Edward VII went Prince of Wales weigh-in, ritual for guests. Before he became king, Edward VII, son of Queen Victoria, and heir to the most powerful throne in the world, perfected a courtly tradition that was equal parts whimsical, invasive, and oddly telling: the weigh-in. Every guest, before attending a royal dinner, was invited, sometimes pressured, to step onto a large set of ceremonial scales. Why? To record their weight before the meal, and then again after. The point? Pleasure. Tracking one's gain in grams was Edward's way of measuring success. The bigger the post-dinner number, the more he believed his hospitality had triumphed. And if that's not a royal habit, what is? George IV, corsets and cosmetics. Before he became king of the United Kingdom, George IV was already ruling something, his own reflection. He wasn't born to war. He wasn't born to philosophy. He was born to the mirror. And for the better part of his life, George devoted his days and especially his mornings to the cultivation of an image so elaborately constructed that it came to define not just his wardrobe, but his worldview. While Napoleon was orchestrating conquests, George was lacing corsets. While revolutions swept through Europe, George powdered his face, curled his hair, and applied a touch of rouge to offset the melancholy of yet another overspent weekend. His daily ritual of self-assembly was, by all accounts, impressive, even theatrical. It began early, often before breakfast. He would rise, often after a long evening of heavy eating, drinking, and theatricals, and submit himself to the ministrations of a small army of valets, tailors, perfumers, and wig stylists. Each had their task. Each knew the routine. First, the corset. George wore one every day for most of his adult life. Tight, excruciatingly tight. Not merely to slim his waist, which expanded steadily as his appetite for indulgence grew, but to present the ideal silhouette one modelled more on classical sculpture and stage actors than on his own body. He reportedly wore corsets so constrictive that he struggled to sit down without discomfort. This did not stop him. Appearances were not just part of his job, they were the job. Next, the cosmetics. Despite already having an aristocratic pallor, George added powder to his face and hands daily. He dabbed on perfume strong, sometimes overwhelming scents that filled the air around him, like a moving cloud of floral diplomacy. He rouged his cheeks, sometimes his lips. He meticulously styled his hair and wore wigs when necessary, though he preferred his own curls, which were carefully oiled and shaped to frame his face just so. His clothing, often custom-designed, extravagantly embroidered, and wildly impractical, was the centerpiece of his performance. Silks, velvets, feathers, buttons by the dozen. Some outfits took hours to assemble. He changed clothes multiple times a day, depending on the event, the light, and his mood. He was never underdressed, even in private. This wasn't just vanity, it was identity. George had grown up under the shadow of his stern father, George III, a king more interested in agriculture and duty than waistlines and watermark silk. His court had been austere, his personality rigid. In contrast, the future George IV rebranded monarchy as a spectacle of decadence, turning Buckingham Palace into more of a private stage than a seat of governance. He surrounded himself with artists, actors, and dandies. He championed fashion, architecture, and the ornamental arts. He spent lavishly, so much so that he plunged himself, and by extension, the nation into debt. Parliament was frequently asked to bail him out, which they did, through gritted teeth and snide remarks about his indispensable wardrobe. The public mocked him. Caricatures of the prince filled the streets, his bulging corset, his overdone makeup, his perfumed airs. He was known as the first gentleman of Europe, though never entirely without irony. Yet he persisted, because ridicule, in George's world, was better than invisibility. Even when his health declined, when the corsets could no longer contain his expanding waist, when the powder settled into the folds of sagging skin, George maintained the rituals. Aided by servants, he continued to dress like a mythic figure from a painting he no longer resembled. His self-image had become a monument, and like most monuments, it couldn't be moved, only maintained. By the time he finally became king in 1820, his reign was more theatrical than political. Parliament did the governing, George did the grand entrance. Every morning, he still layered himself in creams and fabrics. He posed, he powdered, he paraded, as if monarchy itself could be preserved in pomade. He died in 1830, bloated, chronically ill, and nearly blind, but still dressed, still corseted, still clinging to the one thing he had always understood better than power: presentation. And if George tried to rule through appearance, the next king did something stranger. He ruled through companionship, but not with allies, or lovers, or children, with dogs and mirrors. Henry III of France miniature lapdogs and mirror checks. If you happen to wander into the royal chambers of Henry III of France in the late 16th century, you might find yourself tiptoeing not around political intrigue or foreign envoys, but around a dozen tiny velvet-cushioned dogs. And if you were particularly unlucky or lucky, depending on your interests, you'd witness the king stopping mid-sentence to check his reflection in a silver mirror. He didn't apologize. He didn't pretend it wasn't happening. He just paused, pouted slightly, adjusted his lace collar, gave himself a soft nod, and moved on. Henry III ruled France from 1574 until his assassination in 1589, but he didn't rule like his peers. He ruled like a man performing royalty on a very specific stage, one where every detail of his daily life was choreographed, delicate, and scented. His obsession with his appearance was infamous, even in his own time. He dressed extravagantly: ribbons, earrings, lace collars, perfumed gloves, hand-painted fans. He wore elaborate brooches and doused himself in cologne. His beard was trimmed with geometric precision, and his hair, always styled just so, was often the subject of gossip, even among his allies. But his constant companion wasn't power, it was reflection. He carried mirrors, small ones, discreetly tucked into his garments, larger ones, placed strategically throughout his chambers. Servants were instructed to hold them at angles when requested. He was known to stop mid-walk just to inspect his face, his hair, his clothing. The frequency of these checks became court legend. And then there were the dogs. Tiny, pampered, and ever-present, Henry's lapdogs were not just accessories, they were part of his daily ritual. They sat beside him during council meetings. They attended court functions. He spoke to them tenderly, fed them by hand, and reportedly preferred their company to that of most nobles. Foreign diplomats, visiting with urgent matters of war or state, were often greeted by the sight of the king holding one or more dogs in his arms, cooing softly. Some took it as insult, others as confusion. Most didn't know what to make of it. To Henry, it made perfect sense. The dogs were loyal, quiet, uncomplicated, unlike the nobles, unlike the assassins, unlike his brothers. His critics called him effeminate, frivolous, unfit to lead. Caricatures emerged painting him as obsessed with beauty and indulgence, disconnected from the political reality of a country mired in religious war. Some whispered that he cared more about his ruffles than his realm, but they missed something crucial. Henry's habits were armor. Every mirror check was a moment of control. Every miniature dog a reminder of something that didn't plot or scheme. His rituals, seemingly frivolous, were a response to the chaos around him. France was splintering between Catholic and Protestant factions. His family was torn apart by ambition. Assassination attempts mounted. The crown sat heavy. So he lightened it with fragrance, fabric, and the illusion of serenity. It wasn't madness, it was resistance. He was eventually murdered by a fanatical friar. But his legacy isn't just one of excess or vanity. It's the legacy of a man who tried to rule a collapsing kingdom, not with swords, but with scent and silence. And while Henry's obsession was with appearance, the next empress turned her mornings into an endurance sport. She didn't fawn over mirrors, she trained for them. Because beauty, to her, wasn't a gift. It was a full-time job. Empress Elisabeth, Sisi, hours-long hair routine and obsessive exercise. In the imperial palaces of 19th century Austria, one royal figure cut a silhouette so striking that painters couldn't keep up, and neither could the people who worked for her. Empress Elizabeth of Austria, known affectionately as Sisi, wasn't just admired for her beauty, she curated it rigorously, relentlessly, every single day. Her hair care alone could swallow the morning. She had famously long hair down to her ankles, thick, chestnut brown, and heavy. And caring for it wasn't just a matter of brushing and braiding. It was a military operation. Her personal hairdresser, entrusted with the task, often spent 3 hours or more each day cleaning, detangling, arranging, and massaging her scalp. One hair out of place, start over. Dust in the strands, rinse, rescent, restyle. During these sessions, Sisi often read. Sometimes she memorized entire texts. Other times, she just sat in silence, using the stillness as a kind of meditative armor. Her hair wasn't vanity, it was her fortress. But the day didn't end with grooming. It barely began there. Sisi's true devotion was to control, and her preferred method was exercise. Every morning, she weighed herself. Then she trained. Vigorously. Gymnastics, horseback riding, fencing, hiking. She installed a wooden gym in her palace apartments and regularly practiced until exhaustion. She maintained a nearly impossible waist size, reportedly 16 inches, through restrictive dieting and constant movement. She refused most food and drank meat juice as a protein substitute. And while others admired her elegance, she saw none of it as beauty. It was all discipline, and it never stopped. Because Sisi didn't believe in ease, only in control, even if it broke her. And while she punished herself to stay in shape, the next sultan indulged an appetite of a different kind. His obsession wasn't with hair, it was with fur. Ibrahim, Ottoman Sultan, fur mania. In the long, gilded corridors of Topkapi Palace, amid the silks, scrolls, and whispers of the Ottoman court, Sultan Ibrahim I developed an attachment, not to gold. Not to women though, history oversimplifies him there, but to fur. Fur on furniture, fur on walls, fur on clothing, windows, tools, even food containers. It became more than fashion. It became ritual. A plush, relentless, daily necessity. And no one dared ask why. Ibrahim ruled from 1640 to 1648, but his reign was not remembered for diplomacy, war, or architectural glory. It was remembered for softness, literal softness. His daily habits were dominated by an obsession with touch, and in the empire that had produced warriors like Mehmed the Conqueror and Suleiman the Magnificent, this tactile fixation became legend. Each morning, Ibrahim would rise, not always early, and begin his day with furs. A valet would present him with choices, not clothes, textures, sable, ermine, chinchilla, lynx, one for wearing, one for sitting, one for draping. They were rotated, selected, not just by mood, but by how they felt. If the fur was not soft enough, it was discarded. If it was too soft, it might be hoarded. The Sultan's bed was covered in layers of fur throws. The walls of his private quarters were said to be draped in pelted panels. His robes had fur linings inside and outside. Officials who visited often found themselves standing on fur rugs in fur-lined rooms, surrounded by furnishings adorned with animal pelts. Some sources claim that even food bowls were wrapped in fur casings to maintain comfort. Even tools, pens, brushes, trays were covered in patches of fur. Ibrahim surrounded himself with a cocoon of tactile indulgence. It wasn't about luxury, it was about sensation. Ottoman chroniclers, not known for poetic exaggeration, began quietly referring to him as Delilah Sultana, the Mad Sultan. And yet, it wasn't madness in the foaming cinematic sense. It was daily eccentricity elevated to policy. His fur rituals weren't hidden, they were administered, tracked, and facilitated by a bureaucracy that had no idea how to say no to a sultan. Ibrahim believed, reportedly, that furs protected him not just from the cold, but from evil. It was a kind of superstitious shielding. Some claimed he feared illness. Others thought he was trying to ward off curses. Still others said he simply couldn't bear to be touched by anything that wasn't meticulously soft. His royal physicians, instead of addressing the root cause, offered more furs. Or, worse, newer furs. The empire's economy noticed. Fur imports increased. Rare pelts were sought, smuggled, and overpaid for. Traders learned quickly. If you had an exotic animal hide, you could skip 100 tax lines and head straight to the palace. Courtiers began wearing fur to gain favor, even in summer, especially in summer. Diplomats from colder countries found themselves sweating through official ceremonies wrapped in unnecessary sable, hoping to curry favor with a monarch who judged loyalty by texture. Behind the layers, though, was a man haunted by instability. Ibrahim's early life was spent locked in palace rooms, the notorious cafes system, Ottoman royal house arrest, designed to prevent political assassinations. He grew up in isolation, watching brothers be executed, waiting for his own death or coronation. When he finally became Sultan, he stepped into the role with no preparation, little education, and even less trust in the world around him. So he built a new world, one lined with fur. His obsession grew stranger. He once demanded that an entire room be reupholstered with a specific kind of fur, allegedly fox, because the previous type felt aggressive. He held court seated on a fur-covered divan, swaying slightly, stroking the armrest as viziers delivered news of the empire. He issued orders about fur procurement with more attention than he gave to military reports. Eventually, his behavior, eccentric at best, erratic at worst, caught up with him. In 1648, the empire's elite had had enough. He was deposed in a coup, imprisoned, and quietly executed under official orders. The palace removed the furs. The walls were stripped. The robes were burned. The court acted like it had never happened. But servants remembered, traders remembered, and the people remembered. The reign of the Sultan who couldn't be touched by the real world because it was never soft enough. And while Ibrahim softened everything he touched, the next monarch believed he was being touched by forces unseen. Because if the Ottoman court whispered about fur, the Spanish court screamed about demons. Charles II of Spain, constant exorcisms and cures. If you want to understand Charles II of Spain, don't look at his throne. Look at his sickbed. Because for Charles, being king wasn't a triumph, it was a trial. A daily procession of ailments, rituals, and cures administered by priests, healers, and specialists from all corners of Europe. And not for ordinary illness, but for something far more dramatic: bewitchment. By the time Charles became king in 1665, the Spanish court had already turned into a shrine of medical and spiritual experimentation. He was physically weak, often bedridden, and suffered from a constellation of conditions that no one at the time could explain. But instead of chalking it up to biology or heredity, the court turned to something darker. They believed he was cursed. Every morning began with physicians, not one, several. They examined his skin, his pulse, his eyes. Some took urine samples, others read omens. One performed a full diagnostic using relics. Another used prayer. Diagnosis was not a scientific procedure, it was theological theatre. Next came the rituals. Charles was blessed, rubbed with holy oils, touched with bones of saints. He was given holy water, read long passages of scripture, and instructed to recite them back. If his condition worsened, the court escalated. More prayers, more relics, eventually exorcisms. Daily, priests would stand at the foot of the king's bed and shout invocations. They would swing incense, draw crosses in the air, and command invisible forces to leave his body. The palace, meanwhile, had been retrofitted to accommodate these rituals. Rooms were set aside for purification. Every hallway had a crucifix, every entrance a holy talisman. The scent of burning herbs never left the air. Court documents described these routines with deadpan clarity. The king did not eat, one minister wrote, for fear of possession by foreign spirits. Meals were blessed 3 times. Wine was tested with holy artifacts. Servants were watched for signs of witchcraft. And Charles, who lived his entire life in this atmosphere, didn't question it. He accepted it, performed it. He became the center of a daily passion play in which his body was the battlefield and everyone else was a medic, a monk, or a mystic. Foreign envoys were stunned, not by the king's condition they had seen in firm monarchs before, but by the ritualization of his every movement. His inability to walk some days prompted entire chains of prayer across the empire. His bad dreams were analyzed by councils. Even his digestion had its own weekly report. The Spanish court didn't just believe in spiritual warfare, it managed it. Entire ministries were devoted to tracking omens. One advisor reportedly kept a ledger of curses, noting when symptoms aligned with suspected spells. And yet, the more they prayed, the worse he became. He could barely produce speech at times. He never fathered a child. He relied on constant supervision, rarely went outside, and made no real political decisions. But the rituals continued, because stopping them meant admitting defeat, not just of health, but of faith. When Charles died in 1700, the autopsy, a rare and scandalous procedure, shocked the attending doctors. His body was described as underdeveloped, his organs degenerated, and his skull misshapen. The causes, they said, were likely genetic. But for decades, the Spanish court had chased demons instead of answers. And so his reign ended not with a legacy, but with a question. Was he cursed? Or was he simply surrounded by people who couldn't imagine otherwise? And if Charles II lived in a prison of prayers, the next king lived in one made of knees. Because when Henry VI prayed, he didn't stop. All day, every day, for years. Henry VI of England Marathon Devotions. Kings are supposed to be active, decisive, loud, if not in speech, then in sword. Yet Henry VI of England ruled mostly on his knees, not in penance, not in war, but in devotion. Hour after hour, day after day. Sometimes through the night. Prayer wasn't just a ritual for him, it was a schedule, and it took precedence over almost everything, including the realm. He inherited the English throne as a child in 1422 and later the French crown too, in the middle of the 100 Years' War. You could argue that no one was less suited for such a task. He was gentle, pious, conflict-averse, and more interested in saving souls than saving cities. He did not want to conquer. He wanted to contemplate. And once the crown was placed on his head, his response was to fold his hands and close his eyes. What followed was one of the most spiritually intense and politically paralyzed reigns in English history. Henry's daily life was structured like a monk's, not a monarch's. He rose early, not to hunt or strategize, but to pray, and not symbolically. He engaged in prolonged, physically demanding devotions, kneeling for hours, reciting entire psalters, attending multiple masses per day, insisting on long vigils. Witnesses said he often forgot to eat, that he would disappear into chapels for half a day at a time. He would cancel meetings, delay decisions, or refuse to speak, citing his need for reflection. Even his reading was devotional. He favored texts on saints, miracles, and martyrdoms. He surrounded himself with clerics, monks, and confessors. Every action, every movement of his day passed through a spiritual lens. If a petition reached him, he'd pray over it. If a noble sought military funds, he'd consult scripture. If war broke out, he'd weep. And the court began to break under the weight of all this reverence. Because, while Henry folded his hands, England fell apart. Factions formed, ambitious nobles moved unchecked. The French reclaimed lost territory. And those in court who might have reined him in were too frightened or too pious to confront him. After all, how do you argue with a man who spends 12 hours in prayer? Especially when he genuinely believes that prayer is the solution? In the 1452nd, during a particularly unstable stretch of his reign, Henry fell into what modern historians have described as a catatonic state. For over a year, he said nothing, did nothing. He didn't respond to news, orders, or even the birth of his own son. But the rituals didn't stop. His spiritual caretakers maintained the routines around him, read scripture, conducted mass, whispered psalms into his silence. It wasn't a mental break in the usual sense. It was more like a spiritual retreat, so deep that he forgot to come back. Eventually, political factions tired of the passive king. The Wars of the Roses exploded across England. Two rival houses, York and Lancaster, fought for the crown, while Henry receded further into the background, praying for peace as soldiers marched through his kingdom. Even when restored to power for a brief period, he remained the same, calm, humble, and utterly ineffective. Reports from his final years describe him wandering Windsor Castle at odd hours, rosary in hand, murmuring prayers, stopping only to touch relics or kneel before statues. He gave no speeches, issued few orders. When he was eventually murdered in the Tower of London, it was less a regicide than the end of a prolonged spiritual fast. His legacy is strange. He founded Eton and King's College, acts of enormous generosity and foresight. His piety was real, his compassion was noted, but as a ruler, he was empty space, a throne-shaped prayer. Henry VI reminds us that good intentions don't rule kingdoms, and that daily devotion, however sincere, can become its own kind of abandonment. But where Henry disappeared into prayer, the next emperor turned to an even stranger source of daily healing. Not saints, not relics. Scripture. In bite-sized form, Menelik II of Ethiopia, bibliomancy as medicine. By the late 19th century, Menelik II of Ethiopia had become a symbol of African resistance and imperial dignity. He defeated an invading European army at the Battle of Adwa, no small feat in the age of colonial expansion, and held his own as a modernizing monarch. But as he grew older, another legacy emerged. One less military, more mystical, and deeply, stubbornly, daily. He began eating the Bible, not all at once, not randomly, strategically. According to court accounts and foreign observers, during his final years, Menelik suffered from a number of ailments, particularly strokes, which left parts of his body weakened and his speech slurred. Medical treatment was inconsistent. European physicians offered diagnoses, Ethiopian priests offered rituals, but Menelik preferred a different kind of cure, scripture consumed literally. He believed the Holy Text had healing power not just in the spiritual sense, but in the bodily one. Specifically, that ingesting verses from the Bible could heal physical ailments. So he had pages torn from a sacred Diez translation of the New Testament, rolled them up, and swallowed them. Some days it was a few verses, others whole passages. The act wasn't theatrical, it wasn't public. It was private, methodical, and strangely sincere. It became part of his morning routine. He would wake, pray, then ask for scripture. Not to be read, to be consumed. Courtiers watched helplessly. No one dared stop him. His faith was deep-rooted and self-assured. To him, this wasn't magic. It was medicine. And in a way, it fit his broader world view. Menelik II was both a modernizer and a mystic. He introduced electricity to Ethiopia, built railways, negotiated international treaties, and yet still believed deeply in prophecy, talismans, and the mystical forces that governed bodies and nations alike. His palace mixed electric lights with sacred amulets. Engineers walked beside priests. And while his ministers tried to encourage imported medicine, Menelik remained firm. He would take the Bible, one verse at a time. He died in 1913, still convinced that the Book of Books had more to offer than doctors. But if Menelik chewed scripture for healing, the next emperor built healing into his architecture. Not temples, not gardens, an island. And a schedule too precise to question. Tiberius, Roman emperor, island seclusion rituals. By the time Tiberius retired to Capri, the Roman Empire was firmly his. Legions marched in his name. Governors obeyed his letters. Coins bore his image. And yet, every morning, he woke not to the noise of Rome, but to silence. Deliberate, curated, paranoid silence. Capri wasn't a retreat, it was a fortress disguised as a paradise. Tiberius left Rome behind and created a new capital, one built not of marble arches and roaring forums, but of locked doors, controlled entries, and repetitive rituals. He rose early, not because he was industrious, but because the routine started then. Reports suggest he demanded strict order in his villa. Servants moved silently. Meals were timed to the hour. Schedules were predictable, almost oppressively so. Every moment was accounted for, not in grandeur, but in small acts of imperial control. Messages from Rome were read aloud. He rarely responded. Visitors were screened, appointments delayed. His interactions became less frequent, his inner circle tighter. The emperor had vanished in plain sight, alive, aware, but increasingly remote. Even his morning walks, once symbols of civic presence in Rome, became rituals of measurement. He inspected the sea. He observed the skies. He listened, not for gossip or applause, but for silence disturbed. Every detail was studied, every routine repeated. The point wasn't leisure, it was surveillance of others and of the self. And yet, the empire ran. In his absence, governors governed, legions fought, and Rome murmured. Tiberius didn't need to be present. He had become a ghost that ruled by ritual. Eventually, he died quietly, unsurprisingly, off stage. Not with spectacle, but with order. And just as he kept the empire running from an island, the next pharaoh kept his court running with something even stranger. A honey trap, a living fly swatter, a walking, buzzing reminder that too much power makes the smallest problems feel personal. Pepi II, Old Kingdom, Egypt, the fly story. In the hazy golden dawn of Egypt's Old Kingdom, long before pyramids became postcards and pharaohs became symbols, there ruled a boy king named Pepi II. He ascended the throne at around 6 years old, young, divine, and, as the story goes, easily annoyed by flies. Annoyed enough to develop a habit, a very specific, very weird one. He reportedly kept naked servants smeared in honey so that flies would swarm to them instead of him. Now, let's pause. Is it true? Maybe, maybe not. The tale has echoed down the corridors of time with just enough specificity to survive, passed from scribes to scholars to satirists. We find it in medieval chronicles, classical writings, and modern retellings, always tucked between the lines of Egypt's glittering myths. It might be a parable, it might be propaganda, but it's repeated too often to ignore. And whether literal or symbolic, the habit reveals something uncanny, a royal impulse to control not just people, laws, or armies, but insects. Comfort, atmosphere, annoyance. The flies were never the real enemy. It was the feeling of being bothered, the itch that power should have solved, the affront of nature interrupting divinity. So Pepi solved it in the way only a pharaoh could, by humanizing the fly trap. He didn't build nets, he assigned bodies. He created a buffer between himself and the smallest discomfort every day, on command. That's the essence of absolute power, not how it rules nations, but how it warps the mundane. Even if the story is apocryphal, it survived for a reason. It told generations what they needed to believe about Pharaoh Pepi II, that he was powerful, pampered, and impossibly distant from the ordinary world. That when faced with a nuisance, he didn't swat it, he outsourced it, and did so daily, with quiet entitlement. The logistics alone boggle the mind. Who was in charge of honey procurement? Did someone monitor the swarm count? Were the servants rotated out like scented candles or held on standby like ornamental livestock? No ancient scroll answers these questions. The story doesn't care about logistics, it cares about symbolism. Because Pepi II reigned for a staggeringly long time, more than 90 years, if the records are to be believed, he may have been the longest reigning monarch in all of human history. But in the end, that's not what people remember. Not the longevity, not the architecture, not even the divine titles. They remember the flies, and perhaps that's fitting. Because when you rule for a lifetime, when your image is carved into stone and your tomb is planned before you've lost your baby teeth, your habits become more than quirks. They become legacy. The tiny, private rituals like where you sleep, what you drink, or how you deal with bugs outlive your decrees. They become history's footnotes with the emotional weight of entire reigns. So as we close this strange procession of kings and queens, emperors and empresses, obsession and affectation, consider what it means that Pepi II's most enduring story involves honey, flies, and a refusal to be inconvenienced. Not conquest, not wisdom, not even piety. Just the human desire to not be annoyed executed with divine-scale excess. Maybe that's the real mystery of monarchy. Not how they ruled, but how they ritualized the ridiculous. 33 royal habits, each more surreal than the last. And all of them every padded jacket, nightly exorcism, and mirrored lapdog session remind us of a single sobering truth. Even the world's most powerful people still built their lives on strange little comforts, small irrational fears, and routines too bizarre to explain. History is a mausoleum of habits. And power? Power is just the permission to never outgrow them.